She deserves absolutely nothing. My father's voice boomed across the crystal-lit banquet hall, dripping with casual disdain. A total nobody. She never even bothered to build a career. He turned his back to me, raising a crystal flute toward my older brother, Preston, which is why my $2 million villa goes to the son who actually understands success. The room erupted in mocking laughter. My mother nodded in smug approval, and my sister-in-law sneered in my direction. I did not cry, I did not scream. I simply turned on my heel to leave them to their delusions. But as my hand pressed against the heavy mahogany door, it swung open. A silver-haired man in a tailored suit stepped through the threshold. "Excuse me," he announced, his voice slicing through the fading applause. "I am Gregory Pierce, senior editor at Forbes. I urgently need to speak with the secret billionaire behind a $4.5 billion real estate empire, Jade." The laughter died instantly. The entire room froze, staring at the daughter they had just humiliated. I walked away, and over the next 4 days, they lost absolutely everything. Have you ever had a toxic family member try to destroy your self-worth just to make themselves feel powerful? Drop the city you are watching from in the comments below, and make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. You will not want to miss how this trap snaps shut. To understand how I orchestrated the total annihilation of my family's fabricated dynasty, we must rewind exactly 2 hours before Gregory Pierce shattered their reality. It was Friday, October 16th, 2026. I stood completely still against the silk-lined wall of the banquet hall, actively rendering myself invisible. Servers in starched white uniforms rushed past, balancing silver trays laden with champagne flutes and caviar canapes. I observed the spatial dynamics of my father's 70th birthday celebration with the clinical detachment of an auditor inspecting a compromised ledger. Warren held court at the absolute center of the room. He puffed his chest out, projecting the manufactured aura of a logistics titan. He grasped the hands of local politicians and country club elites, his booming laugh dominating the ambient noise. Preston and Vanessa hovered at his immediate right, delivering a masterclass in projecting unearned wealth. Preston adjusted his bespoke cuffs, nodding sagely at whatever banal anecdote our father spun, while Vanessa flashed her artificially brightened smile, her fingers heavy with diamonds Preston could not legitimately afford. I shifted my weight, pressing my shoulders flat against the cool wallpaper. Condescending whispers drifted through the air, carrying fragments of gossip across the room. "That is the daughter." A woman adorned in pearls murmured to her companion, keeping her eyes fixed forward. 34 years old and still drifting. Warren rarely mentions her. "Such a tragedy," the companion replied, swirling her wine, especially compared to Preston. I listened to them categorize me as the definitive failure of the Whitmore bloodline. I did not correct their assumptions. I did not stride over and introduce myself. I engaged my psychological armor, locking away any instinct to defend my existence. Silence was not my weakness, it was my primary weapon. The crowd parted slightly. Preston detached himself from Warren's orbit and marched toward my corner. The scent of heavy, expensive cologne preceded him. He carried a fresh glass of scotch, his posture radiating absolute entitlement. At 38, he still operated under the delusion that he held supreme authority over my life. "Jade." Preston sighed, stopping a few feet away. He scanned my simple black dress, his lip curling in a subtle, practiced sneer. "Glad you decided to show up. Mom was worried you might skip out and embarrass us." "I am here, Preston," I stated, keeping my voice entirely flat. He stepped closer, clapping a heavy hand onto my shoulder. He patted the fabric exactly how one might placate a stray animal. "Listen, do not look so miserable tonight. Dad is retiring soon, and I am taking over the logistics firm. Once I am in the CEO chair, I will carve out a spot for you, maybe a receptionist desk in the back office. We will not let you starve, even if you are a disappointment." He took a sip of his scotch, waiting for me to express gratitude. He craved the power dynamic. He needed me to bow my head and accept his scraps to validate his fraudulent sense of superiority. I stared directly into his eyes, refusing to flinch. "I am perfectly fine, Preston." He scoffed, shaking his head. "Suit yourself. Try not to hover in the shadows too much. It depresses the guests." He pivoted on his heel and sauntered back to the center of the room, rejoining Vanessa, who rewarded him with a triumphant smirk. I absorbed the interaction, letting the sheer, unadulterated injustice coil tightly in my chest. I compressed the frustration, packing it down into a dense, volatile core. They required my subjugation to sustain their fragile egos. My mother, Sylvia, drifted past a few moments later, adjusting the orchids in a tall glass vase. She paused, cast a disapproving glance at my unadorned neck, and kept walking without offering a single word of greeting. I was nothing more than an inconvenient prop to her, a living cautionary tale they utilized to elevate the golden child. A sharp metallic chime cut through the low hum of the ballroom. Warren tapped a silver spoon against his crystal flute. The string quartet ceased playing immediately. The elite attendees turned their attention to the front of the hall, gathering around the head table. I remained anchored to the back wall, obscured by a massive floral pillar. "Family and friends," Warren boomed, his voice amplified by the room's acoustics. 70 years I built my logistics empire from the ground up, and tonight I am surrounded by the people who truly matter. He paused, letting the silence stretch, soaking in the rapt attention of his audience. Sylvia smiled demurely beside him, securing her position as the matriarch. "We built a legacy," Warren continued, pulling a heavy brass key from his tuxedo pocket. "And a legacy requires a worthy successor. Preston, Vanessa, step forward." My brother and his wife stepped into the spotlight, performing manufactured surprise flawlessly. Vanessa covered her mouth, her eyes widening in feigned shock. "Preston," Warren declared, holding the key high. "You have my drive. You possess my vision. You are the future of this family. Tonight, I am gifting you the deed to the Scottsdale property, a $2 million villa for the son who actually understands success." The guests erupted into fierce applause. Preston embraced our father, clapping him on the back while the hired photographer's flash illuminated their victorious grins. A country club associate standing near the front called out over the applause, "What about the daughter, Warren? Does she get a key?" The clapping faltered. The room fell into an awkward, expectant hush. Warren's smile hardened. He did not search the room for me. He simply stared straight ahead, his jaw locked in a rigid line of absolute contempt. "She deserves absolutely nothing," my father announced, his voice echoing against the vaulted ceiling. "A total nobody. She never even bothered to build a career." The brutal finality of his words hung in the air. Then, the laughter began. It started as a low chuckle from Preston and quickly spread through the crowd. I stood motionless in the shadows, watching my own father publicly execute my dignity. I did not shed a tear. I absorbed the mockery, compressing the coiled spring of my restraint to its absolute breaking point. I turned toward the heavy mahogany doors, fully prepared to exit their manufactured reality forever. And then, the brass handles turned, and Gregory Pierce stepped through the threshold. The heavy mahogany doors swung inward, the brass hinges gliding in utter silence. Yet the movement struck the room with the force of a detonating explosive. The lingering applause for Preston's $2 million villa died instantly in the throats of the guests. Crystal flutes halted midair. The hired string quartet froze, their bows hovering inches above cellos and violins. Gregory Pierce crossed the threshold. He did not pause to admire the crystal chandeliers, nor did he acknowledge the ice sculptures melting on the buffet tables. He walked with the focused, unyielding trajectory of an apex predator, tracking a specific scent. His silver hair caught the harsh glare of the overhead lights, and his tailored charcoal suit cut a sharp, authoritative contrast against the pastel gowns and rented tuxedos surrounding him. He navigated the banquet hall not as a guest, but as an executioner, stepping onto a scaffold. The elite crowd instinctively parted, retreating from his path, creating a clear, unobstructed corridor straight to the head table. He stopped 10 feet from where my father stood. Gregory scanned the sea of bewildered faces, his sharp eyes categorizing and dismissing the local politicians and country club members in a fraction of a second. He gripped a thick, distressed leather briefcase in his right hand. "I am Gregory Pierce," he announced. He did not shout. Yet the acoustics of the vaulted ceiling carried his baritone voice to every dark corner of the hall. "Senior editor at Forbes." He adjusted his stance, planting his feet firmly against the polished marble floor. "I demand an audience with Jade." The name dropped like a lead weight. Whispers instantly rippled through the banquet hall, a chaotic buzzing of confusion. I watched the cognitive dissonance violently fracture my father's face. The manufactured aura of the untouchable logistics titan evaporated. His jaw twitched. His eyes blinked rapidly, his mind actively rejecting the data it was receiving. Forbes did not dispatch senior editors to crash private birthday parties. They certainly did not deploy them to seek out the family disappointment. The guests sensed the atmospheric shift. They stepped backward, their expensive leather shoes shuffling against the marble. The social mathematics of the room recalculated in real time. The same people who had just laughed at my expense now darted their eyes toward the shadows where I stood. Their expressions morphed from arrogant contempt to raw, unfiltered confusion. Warren lunged forward, desperate to plug the hole in his sinking ship. He planted himself directly between Gregory and the rest of the room, puffing out his chest to maximize his physical presence. He smoothed the lapels of his tuxedo, attempting to reassert his dominance over the space. "Excuse me," Warren barked, forcing a hollow, abrasive laugh that failed to mask the panic bleeding into his tone. "I believe you are at the wrong venue. Mr. Pierce, this is a private celebration." Gregory did not shift his stance. He did not offer a polite smile. "I possess the correct venue. Warren, my investigative team tracked the location through her holding company's private security detail. I need to speak with Jade immediately." "My daughter," Warren sneered, waving a dismissive hand toward the back of the room. He leaned in, attempting to intimidate the editor with his physical proximity. He deployed his favorite tactic, aggressive gaslighting. "Listen to me very carefully. You are making a massive, humiliating mistake. Jade is a complete nobody. She is unemployed. She possesses no career, no assets, and absolutely no business with a global financial publication." Warren took a half step closer, lowering his voice into a menacing growl. "If she owes your publication money, or if she is tangled in some pathetic legal mess, I will not have her dragging my reputation through the mud tonight. Have your security escort her out." Preston flanked our father, squaring his shoulders to present a united front. "You heard him," Preston added, jutting his chin forward, the scotch sloshing dangerously in his glass. "Turn around and walk out. We are celebrating real success tonight, not indulging my sister's delusions." Gregory did not flinch. He did not acknowledge Preston's existence, nor did he retreat a single inch from Warren's aggressive posturing. Instead, he lifted his briefcase and unclasped the heavy brass locks. The sharp metallic clicks echoed like gunshots in the dead silent room. He reached inside and extracted a thick, embossed leather portfolio. Gregory bypassed the men entirely. He turned his head, his sharp eyes scanning the shadows along the silk-lined wall. He locked eyes directly with me. He saw through my simple black dress. He recognized the apex intellect staring back at him. "Jade," Gregory stated, projecting his voice directly over Warren's shoulder. "My investigative team spent the last 8 months penetrating a labyrinth of offshore trusts, Delaware shell companies, and encrypted holding accounts. We breached the final layer of corporate anonymity exactly 3 hours ago," Warren sputtered, his face flushing a deep, dangerous crimson. He reached out to grab Gregory's arm. "I said, she is a destitute failure." Gregory sidestepped the grasp with fluid, practiced precision, keeping his gaze anchored strictly to mine. "Forbes publishes our annual Billionaires issue tomorrow morning," Gregory continued, his words striking the room like physical blows. "We isolated the sole beneficial owner of the largest private equity and real estate conglomerate in this state. I hold the verified corporate filings, the property deeds, and the asset valuations right here in this portfolio." Gregory tapped the leather cover with his index finger. "I face a midnight print deadline. Jade, I need your confirmation on the record before we go to press." A suffocating vacuum swallowed the banquet hall. Oxygen seemed to vanish entirely from the room. Preston's jaw went slack, his crystal flute slipping a fraction of an inch in his sweating grip. Vanessa covered her mouth, her eyes darting frantically between my unadorned neck and the Forbes editor. Sylvia stood frozen behind the head table, a crumbling statue of maternal denial. The silence stretched, pulling the psychological tension to an agonizing, snapping point. The guests held their collective breath. No one shifted. No one dared to whisper. The mockery, the laughter, the $2 million villa, all of the fabricated superiority my family had meticulously constructed over decades, shattered against the titanium weight of the truth sitting in Gregory's hands. The room waited for my reaction, paralyzed by the sheer gravity of the revelation. I remained anchored to the wall, letting the shockwaves decimate their arrogance. I detached myself from the silk-lined wall. The movement broke the paralysis holding the banquet hall hostage. I did not look at Warren. I did not spare a single glance for Preston or his trembling crystal flute. I locked my eyes on the Forbes editor, offering a singular, sharp nod. "Follow me, Gregory," I instructed, my voice cutting through the suffocating silence. I pivoted and pushed through the heavy mahogany doors, exiting the ballroom. Gregory matched my pace, his leather boots striking the marble floor in perfect rhythm with my heels. The thick, ornate doors sealed shut behind us, trapping my family inside the wreckage of their shattered reality. We navigated the quiet, gilded corridor of the country club. The ambient noise faded, replaced by the rhythmic clicking of our footsteps. As we walked, my mind engaged in a ruthless, chronological audit. I juxtaposed the panic radiating from the ballroom against the spring of 2010. 16 years ago, I stood in the grand foyer of my parents' estate. I was 18 years old. I held a thick, crisp envelope containing an acceptance letter and a full academic scholarship to a premier university. I had spent 4 years sacrificing sleep, social events, and normalcy to secure that funding. I handed the envelope to Warren. He barely glanced at the university seal. He handed it back, offered a stiff, perfunctory handshake, and immediately pivoted toward the driveway. Outside, Preston leaned against the hood of a brand-new, charcoal-gray European sports car. He was 22 years old. He clutched a mediocre business degree earned through a string of C averages and Warren's hefty legacy donations. Warren lobbed a leather-bound key fob through the air. Preston caught it, flashing a triumphant grin, right there on the manicured driveway. Warren clapped his hand onto Preston's shoulder and loudly declared him the new vice president of the logistics firm. They spent the next 16 years meticulously constructing Preston's illusion of competence. I vanished into the background. I did not demand a seat at their table. I did not beg for Warren's validation or fight for a sliver of the logistics empire. I operated entirely undetected in the shadows, forging a titanium foundation of my own. I bypassed the entry-level corporate grind entirely. During my university years, I hoarded every cent of my stipends and internship earnings, while my peers attended fraternity mixers and football games. I sat in the basement of the university library, tearing apart municipal tax default ledgers. I analyzed zoning laws, traffic patterns, and long-term urban development projections. I learned to read a spreadsheet like a predator reads a blood trail. My first acquisition occurred the week after I graduated. I targeted a derelict industrial warehouse sitting on the forgotten outskirts of the city. The property possessed zero aesthetic appeal, but it sat directly adjacent to a proposed highway expansion route. I purchased the lot at a municipal auction for a fraction of its true value. I did not sign the deed under my own name. I established a limited liability company, utilizing a registered agent to mask my identity. Within 6 months, the highway project broke ground. I secured a long-term commercial lease with a major construction conglomerate seeking a staging ground. I took that initial, aggressive cash flow and immediately leveraged it into a dilapidated commercial strip mall. Exponential growth requires absolute, impenetrable secrecy. If Warren discovered I possessed capital, he would attempt to claim it, control it, or sabotage it to protect Preston's fragile ego. I required an ironclad fortress of anonymity. I retained a top-tier corporate law firm, selecting partners who valued billable hours over gossip. We architected a cascading labyrinth of Delaware shell corporations. Those shells fed directly into offshore blind trusts. My name appeared nowhere on any public registry, deed, or tax document. I installed highly paid proxy directors to sign contracts, bid at auctions, and negotiate acquisitions. When my holding company acquired its first city block of commercial real estate, the local press attributed the massive purchase to a faceless private equity syndicate. I read the articles while sitting in a modest, rent-controlled apartment. I ate takeout on a thrift store sofa, monitoring multi-million-dollar asset transfers across a dual-monitor setup, while the city's skyline systematically transferred into my portfolio. The contrast between my reality and Preston's performance art grew sharper with every passing year. I tracked his public financial footprint out of sheer professional curiosity. Preston confused the appearance of wealth with actual liquidity. He leased luxury penthouses he could not legitimately afford. He financed depreciating sports cars at predatory interest rates to project success at country club mixers. During mandatory holiday dinners, the dynamic played out with sickening predictability. We sat around Warren's mahogany dining table. Preston would shoot his cuffs, flashing a leased luxury watch, bragging about a slight quarterly revenue bump at the logistics firm. Vanessa would chime in, detailing their upcoming vacation to a 5-star resort in Aspen. Sylvia would beam with maternal pride, pouring them vintage wine. I would sit at the far end of the table, cutting my steak in silence. They would ask me patronizing questions about my modest apartment or offer me entry-level administrative positions. I would offer a polite, empty smile and decline. They assumed I was paralyzed by a lack of ambition. They had absolutely no idea that just 3 hours prior to carving the turkey, my proxy attorneys had finalized a 9-figure acquisition of a downtown commercial high-rise. Preston accumulated loud, toxic liabilities. He bled Warren's logistics company to fund Vanessa's designer wardrobe, leveraging corporate credit lines to mask plunging quarterly revenues. He shouted his fabricated success from the rooftops, demanding applause for a house of cards built on unserviceable debt. I compounded silent, unencumbered capital. I acquired office parks, residential high-rises, and eventually entire logistics hubs, effectively becoming the landlord for the very competitors slowly crushing Warren's business. The divergence peaked tonight. Preston craved a $2 million villa, gifted to him by a father desperate to manufacture a legacy. I owned the commercial land the villa was built upon, the bank that processed the deed transfer, and the private equity firm holding the debt. I led Gregory down the final stretch of the corridor. We approached a set of frosted glass doors leading to the country club's administrative wing. I pushed the door open, stepping into a sterile, fluorescent-lit conference room. A scratched veneer table sat in the center, surrounded by stiff, mismatched chairs. It was a stark, brutal contrast to the crystal chandeliers and silk walls of the banquet hall. It was the perfect environment for an execution. Gregory stepped inside, placing his heavy, distressed leather briefcase onto the center of the veneer table. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, keeping his eyes fixed on my face. "They are going to follow us," Gregory stated, his voice a low, calm rumble. "I know," I replied, pulling out a chair and standing behind it, anchoring my hands to the top rail. "Warren cannot allow a perceived threat to exit his domain without attempting to assert control. He will bring the entire circus." "Are you prepared for the fallout, Jade?" Gregory asked, his fingers resting on the brass locks of his briefcase. "Once I publish this data at midnight, you can never return to the shadows. The invisible billionaire narrative ends tonight." I looked at the frosted glass doors, watching the blurred, frantic shadows of my family rushing down the hallway toward us. "I am not returning to the shadows, Gregory," I said, my voice dropping to a cold, surgical precision. "I am burning their stage to the ground." The heavy door handles rattled violently. The climax of my 16-year silence was seconds away. The heavy frosted glass door did not merely open. It violently rebounded against the rubber wall stopper, the hinges screaming under the sudden force. Warren breached the threshold first. He marched into the sterile, fluorescent-lit administrative room with the aggressive, uncontrolled momentum of a cornered bull. The manufactured, jovial patriarch who had toasted his country club peers just minutes prior had completely vanished. In his place stood a 70-year-old narcissist whose absolute authority had been publicly challenged. A dark, mottled crimson flush crept up his neck, straining against the starched white collar of his tuxedo. Preston flanked his right side, his jaw locked, his shoulders rolled forward in a crude pantomime of intimidation. Sylvia and Vanessa trailed closely behind, their pastel silk gowns brushing against the cheap linoleum floor. They fanned out the moment they cleared the doorway, instinctively forming a hostile perimeter around the scratched veneer conference table. They brought the suffocating, toxic atmosphere of their fabricated empire directly into the small room. Warren ignored me entirely. He locked his furious gaze onto Gregory Pierce. He lunged forward, slamming his closed fist down onto the center of the veneer table. The hollow thud echoed sharply, rattling the plastic casing of a conference phone resting near the edge. "I do not care what kind of stunt you think you are pulling," Warren snarled, a fine mist of spit flying from his lips. He leaned over the table, attempting to force the Forbes editor into submission through sheer physical proximity. "But you will leave this property immediately. You will not drag your extortion attempts into my celebration." Gregory did not flinch. He kept his hands resting lightly on the brass locks of his distressed leather briefcase. Observing Warren with the detached fascination of a biologist studying a volatile insect, Warren misinterpreted the editor's silence as hesitation. He pressed his perceived advantage, his voice rising to a frantic, abrasive shout. "I know exactly how these scams operate. You run background checks, you find the weakest link in a wealthy family, and you ambush them. Let me make this crystal clear for you, Mr. Pierce. The woman standing behind that chair possesses absolutely nothing." He finally threw a vicious, dismissive glare in my direction. "She rents a pathetic apartment. She holds no title, no assets, and no trust fund. If she acquired some humiliating legal debt, or if she foolishly borrowed money assuming my logistics company would cover her liabilities, you are out of luck. I cut her off financially a decade ago. I will not pay a single cent to bail her out of whatever pathetic mess she created." Sylvia stepped forward, her fingers digging nervously into her diamond necklace. She glanced over her shoulder, terrified the country club elites were eavesdropping through the drywall. "Warren, lower your voice," she hissed, prioritizing her social standing over the escalating conflict. "The guests are staring at the hallway. We need to handle this quietly before the rumors start." Preston seized the opportunity to flex his newly acquired status. He reached into his bespoke trousers and extracted his smartphone, tapping the screen with aggressive, jerky movements. "There is nothing to handle, Mom," Preston sneered, aiming a look of pure contempt at me. "She could not just sit quietly in the back and let us have one night, could she? She had to bring a debt collector to Dad's 70th birthday to ruin the optics." Preston aimed his phone at Gregory like a weapon. "I just acquired a $2 million property. I retain a team of corporate attorneys who specialize in trespassing and harassment. You have exactly 30 seconds to pick up your briefcase and walk out that door, or I'm calling the club's private security detail to drag you out by your lapels." Vanessa scoffed, crossing her arms over her chest. "Honestly, Jade, this is a new low, even for you, extorting your own family on a milestone birthday. You are absolutely pathetic." I stood anchored behind the mismatched conference chair. I did not grip the plastic backrest. I did not cross my arms defensively. I maintained a relaxed, perfectly vertical posture, absorbing their onslaught without offering a single micro-expression in return. I analyzed their heart rates, the sweat accumulating on Preston's brow, the tremor in Warren's hands. They were terrified. Their aggressive posturing masked a deep, fundamental panic. They truly believed I was a destitute failure who had lured a predator to their doorstep, threatening the fragile illusion of wealth they worked so desperately to maintain. They projected their own financial insecurities directly onto me. Warren slammed his fist against the table a second time, the impact vibrating through the floorboards. "Did you hear, my son? Get out. I will not allow a nobody to contaminate my legacy." The coiled spring of my 16-year restraint reached its maximum compression. The time for silent observation officially expired. I released my light hold on the chair. I took one deliberate step forward. My heel clicked sharply against the linoleum. I took a second step. I bypassed the chair entirely, moving with a fluid, predatory grace that instantly shattered the spatial dynamics of the room. I did not retreat toward the wall. I advanced. I stepped directly between Warren and Gregory, physically interposing myself into the line of fire. Warren blinked, his aggressive rant halting mid-sentence. My sudden physical proximity disrupted his momentum. He had spent his entire life expecting me to shrink away, to bow my head, to accept his verbal beatings in passive silence. Reconciling my unyielding stance short-circuited his brain for a fraction of a second. I looked directly into my father's eyes. I did not raise my voice. I did not shout over their frantic threats. I dropped my vocal register into a cold, hollow timbre, the exact tone I utilized to terminate hostile corporate takeovers in boardrooms across the country. "Warren," I stated, stripping away the title of father, reducing him to a mere civilian. "You are done speaking." The words struck him like a physical blow. His mouth parted, a sharp intake of breath hissing through his teeth. But his vocal cords completely failed to engage. I did not wait for his brain to reboot. I shifted my gaze to Preston, who still held his phone suspended in the air. "Put the phone away, Preston. Security is not coming. No one is leaving." Preston swallowed hard. His thumb hovered over the screen, paralyzed by the absolute, glacial authority radiating from my posture. He glanced at Warren for backup, but Warren remained frozen, staring at me as if a stranger had just possessed his daughter's body. Vanessa's arms dropped to her sides. Sylvia took a trembling step backward, bumping into the frosted glass door. The chaotic, abrasive energy they brought into the room evaporated, replaced by a dense, suffocating terror. They recognized the sudden shift in the hierarchy. The prey had just locked the doors to the slaughterhouse. I held the silence, letting the sheer weight of my command crush the remaining oxygen from their lungs. I turned my head slightly, keeping my eyes locked on the men standing before me. "Gregory," I instructed, my voice razor-sharp and echoing with terrifying finality. "Open the portfolio, drop the documents on the table." The brass locks on the briefcase snapped open. The execution officially commenced. Gregory reached into the distressed leather briefcase. The interior compartments rustled as he extracted a thick stack of heavyweight, legal-sized documents. He did not simply hand the papers to Warren, he weaponized them. He slapped the first document onto the center of the scratched veneer table. The crisp parchment hit the surface with a sharp, definitive crack. It was a master organizational flowchart, a sprawling web of black ink detailing dozens of limited liability companies, corporate subsidiaries, and offshore blind trusts. Gregory pulled a second stack of papers from the briefcase, fanning them out across the table like a dealer distributing cards at a high-stakes table. Property deeds bearing municipal seals, certified bank statements displaying balances that stretched across the page, Delaware corporate registry certificates stamped with raised gold notary seals. My family stared at the cascading avalanche of paperwork, their aggressive posturing halting entirely. The sheer volume of the legal documentation commanded the room, sucking the oxygen from the air. "Your assertion that this woman possesses nothing is fundamentally incorrect, Warren," Gregory stated, his baritone voice echoing off the sterile walls. He pointed a steady index finger at the apex of the corporate flowchart. "My investigative unit spent the last 8 months tracing the largest anonymous real estate acquisitions in this hemisphere. We followed the capital through blind trusts in the Cayman Islands, through proxy holding companies in Delaware, and directly into a centralized private equity conglomerate." Warren stepped forward, pulled by an invisible, gravitational force. He leaned over the table, his eyes narrowing as he attempted to decipher the complex corporate structures. "The conglomerate," Gregory continued, tapping the center of the master document, owns the central logistics distribution hubs on the eastern seaboard. It holds the commercial deeds to 3 major downtown skyscrapers. It controls the master lease for the very country club where your guests are currently drinking champagne. Warren's jaw went slack. He recognized the names of the distribution hubs. They were the exact facilities his logistics company relied upon to survive. He rented his warehouse space from those entities. "We breached the final layer of corporate anonymity this evening," Gregory announced, delivering the fatal blow. "We identified the sole beneficial owner of the entire operation. 0 partners, 0 outstanding leveraging debt." Gregory flipped the final document over, laying it perfectly flat in front of my father. It was a certified financial disclosure statement. "The enterprise is valued strictly at $4.5 billion, Gregory said. He shifted his gaze from the documents to my father. "And the sole signature authorizing every acquisition, every trust, and every corporate maneuver belongs to Jade." The silence that followed possessed a physical weight. It crushed the room, pressing down on my family until their fabricated reality fractured into microscopic shards. I watched the cognitive collapse ravage my father's face. The aggressive, flushed crimson that had stained his neck moments earlier vanished, replaced by a sickly, ashen gray. The capillaries in his cheeks constricted, leaching the blood from his skin. He stared at the 9-figure valuations printed in stark black ink. He read my name, printed clearly at the top of the disclosure statement. Warren's hands began to shake. The tremor started in his fingertips and violently reverberated up his arms. He reached out, his knuckles brushing the heavy parchment, as if touching the paper might somehow prove it was a hallucination. It was not. He looked at the total valuation again, $4.5 billion. His mind actively short-circuited as it attempted to process the math. He had spent his entire life building a mid-sized logistics company, inflating his ego over a net worth that might generously reach $40 million. He looked at the daughter he had just publicly exiled, realizing instantly that his entire empire constituted a mere rounding error in my portfolio. I did not just possess wealth, I possessed a scale of financial power that could eradicate his existence with a single phone call. Warren opened his mouth to speak. His lips parted, his tongue darting out to moisten dry tissue, but his vocal cords seized. A pathetic, hollow wheeze escaped his throat. He staggered backward, hitting the edge of the conference table, his legs suddenly unable to support his weight. Preston unraveled seconds later. He lowered his smartphone, the screen turning black. He stared at the property deeds spread across the table. His eyes locked onto a specific municipal zoning map displaying the Scottsdale territories. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. The $2 million villa he had accepted with such immense, gloating arrogance was built on land developed by my subsidiaries. The smug, entitled smirk that Preston wore like a second skin completely melted away. His facial muscles slackened, contorting into an expression of profound, unadulterated terror. He looked at me, his eyes wide and dilated. He saw the cold, rational apex predator standing before him. He realized, with sickening clarity, that he had spent the last 16 years poking a sleeping leviathan. He had demanded I accept a receptionist desk in the back office of a company I could purchase and liquidate before my morning coffee. Sylvia let out a sharp, ragged gasp. Her hand flew to her throat, her fingers frantically clutching her diamond pearls. The strands dug into her skin as she backed away from the table. The maternal facade she projected for the country club elites shattered. She looked at the documents, then at Warren's trembling form, and finally at me. Her mind spiraled, desperately attempting to reconcile the daughter she used as a convenient prop with the financial titan commanding the room. Vanessa shrank into the background. She took 3 rapid steps backward, pressing her spine against the frosted glass door, desperately attempting to render herself invisible. The diamonds on her fingers suddenly looked like cheap costume jewelry in the presence of actual, undeniable power. I remained anchored behind the chair. I observed their physical deterioration without offering a single ounce of mercy. I watched them process the chronological timeline of my deception. I graduated high school in 2010. They had spent 16 years ignoring my existence, leaving me in the shadows while they paraded Preston's debt-fueled illusions around the city. They assumed I was paralyzed by failure. They looked at the dates stamped on the offshore trust formations, 2021. The realization hit them simultaneously. I had been a billionaire for the last 5 years. For 5 years, I had attended their mandatory holiday dinners. I sat in silence while Warren lectured me on ambition. I ate their dry turkey while Preston mocked my modest apartment. I listened to Sylvia brag about Preston's leased sports cars. For 5 agonizing years, they had taunted me, diminished me, and publicly humiliated me, entirely oblivious to the fact that I held the mortgages to their homes, the leases to their distribution centers, and the absolute power to dismantle their lives. I sat at their table, letting them play royalty, while I quietly owned the kingdom. The sheer magnitude of the humiliation washed over them. They were not titans. They were clowns performing in a circus I funded. Gregory broke the silence. He tapped his index finger against his leather portfolio, returning the focus to the imminent deadline. He looked across the table, ignoring the hyperventilating patriarch and the trembling golden child. "Jade," Gregory said, his voice steady and professional. "My editors are holding the front page. We go to press at midnight. I require your official, on-the-record confirmation of these documents before I authorize the publication." Warren snapped out of his paralysis. Desperation overrode his shock. He lunged forward, throwing his hands over the documents, attempting to physically shield the paperwork from existence. "No," Warren croaked, his voice cracking into a frantic, high-pitched plea. "No, wait, you cannot publish this if the club finds out, if the board sees this." He turned his frantic, bloodshot eyes toward me. The arrogant dictator was gone, replaced by a terrified, begging old man. "Jade, please. We can discuss this. We can manage the messaging. Do not let him release this. Please." I did not look at Warren. I did not acknowledge Preston's quiet whimpering or Sylvia's gasping breaths. I bypassed their pathetic display of vulnerability entirely. I looked Gregory Pierce dead in the eye. I held his gaze, my posture perfectly rigid, my expression locked into an unyielding, glacial mask. "Publish it," I commanded. I did not wait to watch Warren's knees hit the linoleum floor. The command hung in the sterile air. Absolute and irrevocable, severing my ties to their fabricated dynasty. I pivoted on my heel, putting my back to the chaotic, wheezing wreckage of my bloodline. Gregory secured the brass clasps of his distressed leather briefcase, the sharp metallic snaps echoing like a gavel striking a magistrate's block. I grasped the frosted glass door handle, pulled it open, and stepped back into the gilded corridor. I left the door slightly ajar, ensuring the muffled, frantic sobs of my mother and the ragged hyperventilation of my brother spilled out into the hallway, a permanent testament to their ruined empire. I marched toward the main ballroom. The rhythmic clicking of my heels against the polished marble dictated the tempo of the ensuing devastation. The news had already breached the perimeter of the conference room. Information in these elite circles travels faster than light. Propelled by the whispers of the invisible class, near the service entrance, a cluster of caterers huddled together, their heads bowed in urgent, hushed exchange. A server holding a silver tray of caviar caught my eye, blanched, and stepped hastily backward, pressing his spine against the floral wallpaper to clear my trajectory. The staff possessed the instinctual awareness to recognize a catastrophic shift in the apex hierarchy. They knew the $4.5 billion valuation had just detonated. I crossed the threshold into the crystal-lit banquet hall. The atmosphere had undergone a violent transformation. The booming laughter, the clinking of crystal flutes, and the arrogant chatter that characterized Warren's 70th birthday celebration had evaporated. A dense, suffocating silence swallowed the room, heavy enough to crush the breath from the attendees' lungs. The hired string quartet stood frozen on their elevated dais, their bows hovering motionless inches above cellos and violins. As I advanced across the room, The social elite, the politicians, the real estate developers, the country club matriarchs tracked my movement. The cognitive dissonance warped their features. An hour ago, I served as their cautionary tale, the destitute daughter utilized to elevate Preston's unearned status. Now, they stared at the undisputed sovereign of the city's commercial skyline. They did not sneer. They did not whisper insults. They physically recoiled. Women draped in pastel silk gowns pulled their skirts back, shrinking away from my path. Men in tailored tuxedos shifted their weight, stepping sideways, knocking shoulders with their peers to clear a wide, unobstructed corridor straight to the exit. They parted like the Red Sea, yielding entirely to the raw, unmitigated gravity of absolute financial supremacy. I kept my posture rigid, my chin leveled, refusing to offer a single nod or glance of acknowledgement. Behind me, a frantic commotion erupted at the ballroom entrance. Warren stumbled through the double doors, his physical deterioration accelerating with every step. The patriarch, who had toasted his own brilliance earlier in the evening, now resembled a hollow shell. His tuxedo jacket hung askew, the pristine white collar of his shirt darkened with cold sweat. He dragged his feet across the marble, his breath hitching in loud, erratic rasps. He attempted to project his former authority, raising a trembling, liver-spotted hand to address his peers. He craved the validation that had sustained his narcissism for 7 decades. "Ladies and gentlemen," Warren croaked, his voice cracking violently, stripped of its booming resonance. "A minor misunderstanding, a temporary complication." The reaction was immediate, synchronized, and lethal. A prominent local judge standing near the melting ice sculpture pivoted on his heel, presenting his back squarely to my father, a logistics competitor, a man Warren played golf with every Sunday, set his champagne flute down on a passing tray and turned away without a word, within seconds. The entire room executed a silent, devastating excommunication. The guests turned their backs, forming a solid, impenetrable wall of bespoke suits and designer fabrics, completely erasing Warren from their social registry. They recognized a sinking ship. In their world, a man who could not identify a titan sitting at his own dining table constituted a massive social and financial liability. His fabricated empire burned to ash in real time, leaving him isolated on an island of his own profound incompetence. I continued my steady march toward the cloakroom, entirely unaffected by his public execution. The heavy exit doors loomed ahead. Then, the frantic, erratic clicking of stilettos echoed behind me, cutting through the suffocating quiet of the ballroom. "Jade, wait. Please, Jade, wait." Vanessa sprinted across the marble foyer, abandoning all pretense of aristocratic grace. Her manufactured poise had completely disintegrated. A sheen of perspiration ruined her immaculate foundation, and her chest heaved as she desperately tried to close the distance before I breached the exit. I stopped. Turning my head just a fraction of an inch, Vanessa crashed into my personal space, her breathing ragged and desperate. She reached out, her hands trembling violently, and clamped her manicured fingers around the sleeve of my black dress. "Jade, we didn't know," she stammered, her voice pitched in a high, pathetic whine. Her eyes darted wildly, searching my face for a shred of the sister-in-law she had mocked for 16 years. Preston was just... Warren made him act that way. We are family. You know I always supported you. Right. I never agreed with how they treated you. Please. You have to talk to Gregory. You have to tell Forbes to kill the story. You have to fix this. I looked down at her hand. The diamonds on her fingers purchased with funds bled from a dying logistics company dug into the premium fabric of my sleeve. She represented the ultimate parasite, perfectly willing to discard her husband and father-in-law the second their host body expired. I did not raise my voice. I did not express anger, betrayal, or vindication. I engaged a state of absolute chilling detachment. I lifted my left hand and clamped my thumb and index finger around her wrist. I applied a precise, calculated pressure directly to the joint, forcing her tendons to lock. Vanessa gasped, her mouth falling open as a shock of pain radiated up her arm. Her grip slackened instantly. I meticulously peeled her fingers off my sleeve, pushing her hand away with glacial revulsion. "Do not touch me," I stated, my tone entirely devoid of empathy. Vanessa stumbled backward, clutching her wrist against her chest, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror. She realized I possessed no familial loyalty to exploit. The ATM was permanently closed. I smoothed the microscopic crease in my sleeve, turning my back on her weeping, pathetic display. I pushed the heavy brass handles of the main exit, stepping out into the freezing October night. The sharp, icy wind hit my face, carrying the bitter scent of dried leaves and impending winter. The frigid air felt like absolute purification, washing away the toxic residue of the banquet hall. A sleek, black-armored SUV idled quietly at the base of the concrete steps, the exhaust pluming into the dark sky. My security detail stood at attention, pulling the heavy, reinforced rear door open the exact moment I approached. I slid onto the plush leather seat, the interior smelling of rich upholstery and sterile efficiency. The heavy door slammed shut, sealing with a definitive, pneumatic hiss. The thick, bulletproof glass insulated me entirely from the country club, the ruined birthday party, and the annihilated dynasty I left suffocating in the wreckage. I stared out the tinted window as the vehicle accelerated down the winding driveway, leaving the shadows behind forever. Saturday, October 17th, 2026, exactly 6 in the morning. The horizon over the city's skyline bled a pale, metallic gray, piercing the lingering shadows of the night. I stood on the wraparound terrace of my penthouse, 50 stories above the concrete grid. The frigid autumn wind whipped the hem of my silk robe, biting at my skin, but I remained perfectly still. I grasped a porcelain mug, the steam curling upward from the scalding black coffee, grounding me in the absolute silence of the dawn. Resting on the glass patio table, my custom encrypted smartphone flared to life. The screen illuminated the darkness. A single, silent notification materialized on the lock screen, followed instantly by a cascading waterfall of digital alerts. The vibration motor buzzed against the glass in a relentless, synchronized rhythm. Gregory Pierce met his midnight print deadline. The Forbes article went live globally. I picked up the device, unlocking the heavily fortified operating system with a biometric scan. I opened the browser. The premier financial publication of the world devoted its entire digital front page to the revelation. The headlines stretched across the screen in stark, unforgiving typography: "The Secret Sovereign," how a 34-year-old architected a $4.5 billion real estate empire. Beneath the headline sat a high-resolution photograph of my flagship commercial skyscraper, juxtaposed with the verified corporate flowcharts Gregory had dropped onto the conference room table mere hours ago. The publication detailed the staggering volume of my assets: the distribution hubs, the residential complexes, the private equity holding accounts. It exposed the meticulous, 16-year strategy I executed while operating entirely undetected. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee, letting the bitter heat wash over my palate. I dragged my finger across the screen, scrolling past the financial breakdowns and the offshore trust analyses. Gregory possessed a ruthless editorial instinct. He closed the feature with a direct, devastating account of the birthday banquet. He documented the exact moment my father raised his crystal flute and gifted the $2 million villa to the golden child. The trap I spent a decade and a half constructing snapped shut with global reverberations. I turned away from the biting wind, sliding the heavy terrace doors open, and stepped into the climate-controlled sanctuary of my penthouse. I navigated across the Brazilian hardwood floors to my central command terminal, a sleek, multi-monitor workstation dominating the far wall of the living space. I initiated the boot sequence, bypassing the encrypted firewalls to access my proprietary data streams. By 8 in the morning, the financial television networks hijacked the narrative. I commanded the wall-mounted displays to pull the live broadcasts. Every major market analysis channel abandoned their scheduled programming. The anchors sat at their glass desks, frantically dissecting the Forbes drop. The producers orchestrated a masterpiece of visual humiliation. The screen split into two distinct panels. On the right, the networks displayed a scrolling ticker of my verified asset valuations, highlighting the sheer monopolistic scale of my commercial holdings. On the left, they looped a piece of shaky, smartphone video footage captured by a catering staff member at the birthday party. The footage played on a continuous, inescapable loop. Warren stood at the head table, his chest puffed out, clutching his champagne flute. The audio feed crackled, but the microphones picked up his voice with devastating clarity. She deserves absolutely nothing, a total nobody. She never even bothered to build a career. The financial anchors dissected the quote, eviscerating my father's fabricated legacy on live television. They contrasted his estimated $40 million net worth against my $4.5 billion empire. They highlighted the grotesque irony of a mid-level logistics manager publicly exiling a sovereign financial titan. They exposed him not merely as a cruel patriarch, but as a man entirely blind to the realities of the business world he claimed to conquer. I sat back in my ergonomic leather chair, tracking the digital shockwaves as they fractured Warren's social foundation. My private equity firm held the master commercial lease for the elite country club where my parents spent their weekends cultivating their status. I possessed unfettered administrative access to the club's back-end management portal. I opened the tea time reservation ledger and monitored the real-time fallout. At 8:15 in the morning, a prominent local judge canceled his standing Sunday golf match with Warren. At 8:20, two real estate developers scrubbed their names from Warren's upcoming charity luncheon table. At 8:40, the club's membership director flagged Warren's profile, placing his upcoming dining reservations on a provisional hold. The social erasure executed itself with breathtaking velocity. In Warren's world, perception constituted the only currency that mattered. To associate with a man who publicly humiliated a billionaire daughter demonstrated catastrophic judgment. The country club elites did not call him to demand an explanation. They did not offer sympathies. They simply severed the ties, isolating him on an island of his own profound incompetence. He became a radioactive liability before he even finished his morning coffee. The devastation bled directly into Preston's domain. I shifted my focus to the logistical network monitoring screens. Preston relied heavily on handshake agreements and social leverage to mask the plunging revenues of his father's company. He assumed his newly acquired $2 million villa would project enough stability to secure extended credit lines from his supply chain vendors. He failed to realize that my holding company controlled the premium loading docks his fleet required to operate. I accessed the internal communications dashboard connecting my warehouse managers. The alerts flashed red across my screen. Preston's business associates, the men who clapped him on the back and drank his scotch the previous night, began pulling their contracts. The vendors read the Forbes article. They saw the financial networks dismantling the Whitmore illusion. They recognized that a vice president who accepted a fraudulent crown while his sister owned the kingdom lacked the basic intelligence required to manage a supply chain. I watched the logistics firm's daily operational metrics hemorrhage. Subcontractors denied Preston's transport trucks access to premium bays. Credit lenders froze his short-term borrowing accounts. His emails bounced. His calls dropped into voicemail voids. The industry excommunicated him, stripping away the unearned authority he wore like a cheap suit. My smartphone vibrated against the glass desk, breaking my concentration on the plummeting metrics. I glanced down. The red notification badge on my voicemail application climbed with frantic, relentless speed. 50 unheard messages, 100, 200. The digital floodgates opened. The relatives who spent 16 years treating me like an invisible. Inconvenient props suddenly discovered a desperate need to reconnect. Aunts who conveniently forgot my graduation. Uncles who mocked my modest apartment. And cousins who snickered at Warren's cruel jokes flooded my inbox. I tapped the screen, routing the audio through the terminal's surround sound speakers. "Jade, darling," a maternal aunt cooed, her voice trembling with manufactured affection. "We just saw the news. We are absolutely stunned. Your uncle and I always knew you were destined for greatness. We always said you possessed a special spark. Please, call us back. We would love to host you for dinner tonight." I dragged the audio file to the trash bin. Deleted. The next message played. It was a distant cousin, a man who cornered me at Thanksgiving 3 years ago to offer me a minimum wage filing job at his dealership. Hey, Jade. Wow. Listen, I know we have not connected in a while, but family is family. Right. I have this incredible investment opportunity, and I know you appreciate a solid return. Let me know when you have a minute to talk strategy. I tapped the screen. Deleted. The voicemails cascaded, a pathetic symphony of backtracking, gaslighting, and unadulterated greed. They attempted to rewrite a decade and a half of psychological abuse, packaging their desperation as familial loyalty. They craved proximity to the $4.5 billion. They assumed the blood in our veins obligated me to throw them a lifeline. I sat in the glow of the monitors, listening to their frantic attempts to salvage their connection to the apex predator they failed to recognize. I did not experience a single ounce of satisfaction from their apologies. I felt nothing but a cold, clinical revulsion. I pressed a single button, executing a mass deletion protocol. The entire inbox vanished, wiping their pathetic voices from my existence. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the glass desk, and turned my attention back to the live financial broadcasts. I allowed my family to drown in their self-inflicted humiliation, secure in the knowledge that the true execution had not yet begun. The social exile merely set the stage. The federal trap waited just beneath the surface, primed and ready to break their bloodline permanently. Sunday, October 18th, 2026. The morning sun cast long, geometric shadows across the Brazilian hardwood floors of my penthouse. I sat at my glass command desk, reviewing the overnight data streams monitoring my commercial acquisitions. The high-altitude silence of the 50th floor remained absolute, insulated entirely from the chaotic grid of the city below. Then, the secure intercom embedded in the surface of my desk chimed. I tapped the illuminated icon. The voice of my building's head of security filled the room, clipped and strictly professional. Ms. Whitmore, I apologize for the interruption. We have a security breach in the main lobby. 2 men bypassed the exterior concierge perimeter by tailgating a courier through the loading dock vestibule. They are currently demanding access to the private elevator banks. They claim to be your father and brother. My team intercepted them, but they are escalating the situation. Shall I contact law enforcement to execute a removal? I pulled up the live security feed on my secondary monitor. The high-definition cameras captured Warren and Preston, cornered by 3 men in tailored black suits. Warren jabbed his finger aggressively at the lead guard's chest, his mouth moving in frantic, exaggerated shouts. Preston paced behind him, running his hands through his hair, radiating a toxic, volatile panic. They looked nothing like the aristocratic titans who toasted their fabricated legacy in a crystal-lit banquet hall just 48 hours ago. They looked like cornered animals. No, I instructed, my voice flat and void of any inflection. Disengage your team. Grant them access to the executive elevator. Route them directly to my floor. Understood, ma'am. I terminated the connection. I did not stand up. I did not adjust my posture. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, steeping my fingers together, and waited for the prey to walk into the observation enclosure. 3 minutes later, the brushed steel doors of the private elevator parted with a soft and pneumatic hiss. Warren and Preston stepped directly into the sprawling expanse of my penthouse. The sheer scale of the architecture, the vaulted ceilings, the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the skyline I practically owned, struck them like a physical blow. Their momentum faltered. They hesitated on the threshold, their eyes darting across the museum-quality minimalist space, struggling to reconcile the destitute daughter they had mocked with the apex sovereign who resided here. I remained seated behind the glass desk, offering zero hospitality. I did not invite them to sit. I did not offer them coffee. I subjected them to an agonizing, protracted silence, forcing them to initiate the engagement. Warren broke first. He crossed the room, his leather shoes striking the hardwood with heavy, uncoordinated thuds. He bypassed any semblance of a greeting. He bypassed any acknowledgement of his brutal, public humiliation of me. The concept of an apology did not even breach his consciousness. You created a catastrophe. Jade, Warren barked, his voice straining, completely stripped of its former booming resonance. He began pacing the length of my living space, his trajectory erratic and frantic. The Forbes article, the financial networks. Do you have any concept of the damage you unleashed? My phone has not stopped ringing. My vendors are panicking. The country club board requested my temporary absence. He dragged a crumpled linen handkerchief from his pocket and pressed it against his forehead. A heavy, greasy sheen of sweat coated his skin. The capillaries in his cheeks stood out in stark, jagged lines. He was physically unraveling, vibrating with a chaotic and suffocating terror. You deliberately orchestrated a public relations nightmare. Warren continued, breathing in shallow, ragged gasps. You humiliated this family to feed your own ego. You hid this empire from us and then dropped it on my 70th birthday to sabotage my legacy. I tracked his movements, my expression an impenetrable, glacial mask. He possessed a staggering capacity for delusion. He stood in the center of a $4.5 billion fortress, yet he still attempted to project authority, blaming the victim of his psychological abuse for surviving it. Preston stepped forward, attempting to salvage their rapidly disintegrating offensive line. He planted his hands firmly on the edge of my glass desk. He leaned in, trying to utilize his physical size to intimidate me, a tactic that might have worked when I was a teenager, but now merely highlighted his profound impotence. I subjected his physical state to a ruthless forensic audit. His bespoke suit, the armor he wore to project absolute superiority, hung off his frame. The fabric looked slept in, wrinkled at the elbows and knees, dark. Bruised circles shadowed his eyes. A muscle in his jaw twitched in a rapid, uncontrollable spasm. His carotid artery pulsed frantically against his neck. "Cut the silence, Jade," Preston snarled, his breath smelling faintly of stale scotch and raw fear. "We are not here to debate the morality of your little stunt. We are here to manage the fallout. The negative press is impacting the logistics firm's short-term liquidity. We need a temporary capital injection to weather the storm." Preston pulled a single sheet of paper from his jacket pocket and slammed it onto the glass surface. "We require a family investment," Preston demanded, jutting his chin forward, attempting to mask his desperation with arrogant entitlement. $20 million. It is an absolute drop in the bucket compared to the valuations Forbes published. You wire the funds into the corporate holding account by tomorrow morning. We use the capital to secure our supply chain lines, project stability, and quiet the rumors. I looked down at the crumpled piece of paper, then raised my eyes, locking them onto Preston's twitching jaw. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with surgical, absolute precision. "A family investment." "Exactly." Preston clipped, his knuckles blanching as he gripped the edge of the desk. "You owe us that much for creating this crisis." I processed the data. I analyzed the specific number. $20 million. A successful mid-size logistics company experiencing a minor public relations crisis does not require a $20 million emergency cash injection on a Sunday morning. A healthy corporation possesses contingency funds, revolving credit lines, and asset-backed buffers. Warren and Preston were not asking for expansion capital. They were not asking for a temporary bridge loan to soothe nervous vendors. They were begging for a lifeline. I observed Warren, who had stopped pacing. He stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, his chest heaving, his eyes fixed on my face with a terrifying, hollow hunger. He needed me to capitulate. He needed the daughter he labeled a nobody to save him from absolute ruin. They were drowning. The logistics firm was not suffering from a temporary liquidity issue. It was structurally collapsing. The sudden, extreme demand for $20 million indicated a catastrophic, systemic hemorrhage hidden deep within their ledgers. They needed liquid cash to cover a massive, imminent liability, a liability they could no longer mask now that their social credibility had evaporated. I let the silence stretch, stretching the psychological tension until it threatened to snap their spines. Preston's breathing grew louder. The sweat beaded on his upper lip. He broke eye contact, unable to sustain the weight of my cold, analytical stare. "Well," Preston demanded, his voice cracking, revealing the terrified child hiding beneath the bespoke suit. Are you going to authorize the wire transfer or not? I placed my hands flat on the surface of the glass desk. I did not blink. I did not offer a single micro-expression of empathy, anger, or vindication. I projected an aura of pure, unadulterated void. I do not authorize blind capital injections, I stated, my tone chilling the ambient air of the room. If you require $20 million from my private equity firm, you will submit to a comprehensive forensic audit. I will review your corporate ledgers, your accounts payable, and your internal banking routing structures. Warren stepped away from the window, his face contorting in panic. We do not have time for a drawn-out audit. We need the capital tomorrow. What? You will receive nothing without full transparency, I replied, my voice echoing with terrifying finality. I maintained my fixed, dead-eyed stare on Preston. Bring your master financial portfolios to the logistics firm's corporate boardroom. I will meet you there on Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock. If the math aligns with your projections, we will discuss the transfer. Tuesday, Preston gasped, his fingers curling into tight, shaking fists. Jade, you do not understand the leverage? Tuesday at 10, I interrupted, stripping the air from his lungs. Or I instruct security to physically remove you from my building, and you secure your $20 million elsewhere. Preston opened his mouth, his face flushing with a violent, impotent rage. He realized he possessed absolutely zero leverage. The hierarchy had permanently inverted. He snapped his mouth shut, his teeth grinding audibly. He snatched the crumpled paper off the glass desk and shoved it back into his pocket. Tuesday, Preston hissed, spinning on his heel. He grabbed Warren by the arm, dragging the broken patriarch toward the elevator banks. I watched the brushed steel doors slide shut, swallowing my father and brother, sealing them inside a metal box of their own escalating terror. I turned my chair back to my workstation, my pulse remaining perfectly steady. I had no intention of handing them $20 million. I intended to tear their ledgers apart and discover exactly what kind of monster chased them into my penthouse. The moment the penthouse security system confirmed the perimeter was locked down, my focus shifted entirely to the central workstation. While the world recognized me as a real estate sovereign commanding a skyline of glass and steel, my true foundation had always been built on forensic finance. The empire began not with brick and mortar, but with the ruthless excavation of corporate lies and the systematic hunting of anomalies that arrogant men believed they had buried forever. I woke the 6 monitors mounted across my glass desk, their cold glow cutting through the artificial twilight of the room. I initiated the investigation by extracting the superficial public corporate filings for Whitmore Logistics. I pulled their quarterly reports, shareholder disclosures, and annual tax summaries for the past 5 years, on paper. The documents projected a narrative of stagnant but reliable stability. The revenue lines held steady, and the operating costs fell within standard industry parameters. I dragged the public filings into the trash bin. A man attempting to conceal a hemorrhage does not broadcast the bleed on his front lawn. I bypassed the public registry entirely. I launched a proprietary penetration protocol I originally engineered to audit offshore tax havens. Lines of neon green code cascaded down my primary monitor, bypassing the logistics firm's outdated commercial firewalls. Within 12 minutes, I breached their deeper banking nodes, gaining unfettered read-only access to their internal accounts, payable ledgers, and central operating accounts. I deployed a tracing algorithm, instructing the software to flag high-frequency, high-volume capital outflows. The system queried thousands of transactions. A glaring, catastrophic pattern emerged almost instantly. Millions of dollars bled from the central operating account, systematically routed to 3 specific vendor-limited liability companies. The invoices designated these vendors as primary suppliers of diesel fuel, fleet maintenance parts, and international shipping containers. I isolated the vendor names Apex Freight Solutions, Meridian Logistics Partners, and Vanguard Transport Supply. I ran a cross-reference utilizing federal commercial databases. The geographical footprint of all 3 entities converged on a single, anonymous post office box located in Wilmington, Delaware. I pinged their registered corporate officers. The database returned proxy signatures provided by a bulk registration service. These entities possessed zero physical infrastructure. They operated no warehouses. They employed zero mechanics. They fueled zero trucks. They were phantom nodes. They existed solely as digital funnels designed to siphon capital away from Whitmore Logistics. I unleashed a secondary algorithm, locking onto the routing numbers attached to the Delaware shell companies. I tracked the capital as it bounced through a labyrinth of secondary clearinghouses, intentionally scrambled to confuse a standard audit. But Preston lacked the intellectual rigor required to launder capital effectively. He left microscopic digital fingerprints on every transfer. The funnels consolidated. The stolen capital pooled into 2 private wealth management accounts registered in the Cayman Islands. I cracked the encryption on the Cayman accounts. The raw transaction history populated my screen. The ledgers documented a grotesque, unhinged consumer lifestyle. The stolen capital did not sit in investment portfolios. It hemorrhaged outward, funding the exact fabricated dynasty Preston paraded around the country club. I highlighted the expenditures, connecting the stolen logistics funds directly to the golden child. $300,000 routed to a luxury automotive broker in Manhattan, securing the lease for the charcoal gray European sports car Preston parked in my father's driveway. $50,000 wired to a bespoke jeweler, purchasing the exact diamond necklace Vanessa wore to the 70th birthday banquet. $100,000 transferred to a private aviation charter, funding their documented luxury vacations to 5-star resorts in Aspen. Over the span of 4 years, Preston authorized the fraudulent transfer of nearly $9 million. He weaponized his unearned title of vice president. He exploited Warren's blind, narcissistic trust. Warren signed off on the macro-level budgets, completely oblivious to his son hollowing out the foundation of his life's work. Preston bled his father's company dry to finance the illusion of his own success. Whitmore Logistics constituted a hollowed-out carcass, propped up entirely by toxic debt and fabricated revenue sheets. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the cascading numbers illuminating the dark room. The math proved Preston operated as a massive corporate embezzler. It proved he actively orchestrated the bankruptcy of his own family. I rubbed my temples, shifting my focus from the raw data to the psychological profile of the perpetrators. I processed the physical behavior Warren and Preston exhibited in my living space 20 minutes ago. The twitching jaws, the rapid, shallow breathing, the sweat soaking through their shirts. I frowned. A glaring discrepancy fractured the narrative. Embezzlement constitutes a slow, creeping death. A failing logistics company eventually files for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The courts restructure the debt over years. Creditors negotiate settlements. It represents a tedious, bureaucratic demise. A corporate executive facing standard insolvency does not bypass building security on a Sunday morning. A man watching his company slowly sink does not storm a penthouse demanding a specific, astronomical sum of liquid cash. They demanded exactly $20 million. They demanded the capital by tomorrow morning. The sheer, visceral dread radiating from Preston did not align with a slow corporate bleed. He looked like a man standing on the trapdoor of a gallows, listening to the executioner pull the lever. Embezzlers hide. They obfuscate. They do not launch aggressive, desperate demands for 8-figure bailouts unless a specific, lethal entity demands that capital from them. The embezzlement alone failed to explain the imminent, fatal collision they anticipated. I shifted my posture, planting my feet firmly against the hardwood floor. I abandoned the accounts payable ledgers. If Whitmore Logistics hemorrhaged $9 million over 4 years, they lacked the operating capital required to keep their trucks on the highway. To maintain the illusion of solvency, Preston required a massive external influx of cash. He required debt. I closed the internal logistics nodes and pivoted my investigation toward the macro-level commercial credit registries. I accessed the Federal Uniform Commercial Code databases, querying institutional lenders, private equity sharks, and high-risk commercial banks. I hunted for corporate bonds, leveraged buyouts, or mezzanine financing attached to Whitmore Logistics within the last 6 months. I needed to locate the exact trigger. I needed to find the specific monster breathing down their necks, the apex predator that possessed the leverage to make Preston tremble. I typed a final sequence of commands, instructing the algorithm to flag any commercial debt originating in the third quarter of 2026. The loading bar flashed across my screen, querying global banking networks. I waited in the silence of my penthouse, ready to unearth the fatal mistake that drove my brother to my door. The loading bar on my primary monitor flashed, transitioning from a pulsing neon green to a stark, blinding crimson. The algorithm completed its sweep of the Federal Uniform Commercial Code registries. A single, heavily encrypted file materialized on the screen, isolated from the chaotic noise of the global banking network. I double-tapped the icon. The document expanded, rendering a high-resolution scan of a commercial promissory note across my display. I scanned the header. The originating institution operated as a predatory, high-yield mezzanine lender headquartered in Manhattan, the specific breed of financial shark that underwrote desperate, toxic debt at crippling interest rates. The origination date stamped across the top of the contract read July 2026, exactly 3 months ago. I shifted my gaze down the page to the principal amount, $15 million. My pulse, which had maintained a steady, resting rhythm throughout the entire forensic audit, suddenly halted. A profound, icy chill radiated from the base of my spine, spreading outward to freeze the blood in my veins. $15 million represented an impossible sum for Whitmore Logistics to secure independently. Warren's hollowed-out company lacked the physical collateral to underwrite even a fraction of that principal. A predatory lender would require an ironclad, unencumbered guarantor to authorize a capital transfer of that staggering magnitude. I scrolled down to the underwriting section, seeking the guarantor signature line. I expected to find Warren's name, perhaps backed by a fraudulent appraisal of the company's transport fleet or a leveraged lien against his personal estate. I did not find Warren's name. I did not find Preston's name. I found mine. Printed in stark, uncompromising black ink, my full legal name sat on the primary borrower line. Beneath it, my social security number populated the identification fields, a digital signature, masterfully forged to mimic the precise slant and pressure of my handwriting, anchored the bottom of the contract. A verified digital notary stamp flanked the forgery, cementing its apparent legality. I gripped the edge of my glass desk. The sheer, breathtaking malice of the document struck me with physical force. Preston did not just embezzle $9 million to fund his luxury cars and bespoke suits. When the walls began closing in, when the logistics firm teetered on the brink of total, unavoidable insolvency, he required a massive, immediate influx of cash to plug the holes and maintain his charade. He possessed no credit. He possessed no liquid assets. But he possessed a sister he believed lived a meager, invisible existence. I connected the psychological dots, decoding the trap my brother spent the summer constructing. Preston viewed me as a blank slate. To him, I represented a 34-year-old woman with zero debt, zero public liabilities, and a pristine, untouched credit profile. He weaponized my financial innocence. He leveraged the very modesty he mocked to secure $15 million of highly toxic cash. He fed my identity into the underwriting software. The predatory algorithms scanned my public credit history, recognized an unblemished record, and rubber-stamped the approval. The capital cleared. Preston intercepted the funds, routing them directly into the dying veins of Whitmore Logistics, buying himself a few more months of fabricated glory. I pulled the amortization schedule attached to the promissory note. I analyzed the repayment terms. It was a bridge loan, engineered to detonate. The grace period spanned exactly 90 days. The first mandatory repayment installment, a crushing, multi-million-dollar balloon payment defaulted next week. The scope of his sociopathy laid itself bare across my monitors. Preston engineered my absolute destruction. He calculated the timeline with chilling precision. He knew Whitmore Logistics lacked the operating capital to make the first payment. He fully intended to let the loan default. When a $15 million fraudulent loan defaults, the financial institution does not send polite reminder letters. They deploy a legion of federal litigators. They initiate immediate asset seizures. They contact the Federal Bureau of Investigation to report massive bank fraud. Preston planned to let the federal government obliterate my life. He intended for armed agents to kick down the door of my modest apartment. He expected federal prosecutors to drag me into a courtroom, confronting me with documents bearing my exact name and social security number. He anticipated I would scream my innocence, lacking the resources to afford a defense attorney capable of untangling the digital forgery. He envisioned me rotting in a federal penitentiary for the next 2 decades. Meanwhile, he would stand by, playing the tragically deceived brother. He would continue driving his European sports car. He would reside in his $2 million Scottsdale villa, secure in the knowledge that he possessed the ultimate, disposable scapegoat. That specific timeline explained his behavior in my penthouse this morning. That explained the flop sweat, the dilated pupils, and the frantic, twitching jaw. When Gregory Pierce dropped the Forbes documents onto the conference table on Friday night, he did not just humiliate Preston, he destroyed Preston's exit strategy. Preston realized he did not forge the signature of a defenseless, destitute civilian. He forged the signature of a billionaire possessing the capital, the legal arsenal, and the apex intellect required to trace the fraud directly back to him. He realized that when the loan defaulted next week, the bank would not seize a modest apartment. They would attempt to seize assets from a $4.5 billion private equity conglomerate. He recognized that I would detect the anomaly instantly and deploy a team of ruthless corporate litigators to hunt down the perpetrator. He needed $20 million from me this morning not to expand the logistics firm, but to quietly pay off the toxic loan before it defaulted. He was frantically attempting to erase the forgery before I discovered it. I released my tight grip on the edge of the desk. The icy chill in my veins evaporated, replaced by a dense, hyper-focused heat. I did not panic. I did not hurl my coffee mug against the wall or scream at the ceiling. Emotion constitutes a severe vulnerability in forensic warfare. I compartmentalized the betrayal, locking it away behind a steel vault in my mind. I cracked my knuckles, returning my hands to the keyboard. Preston brought a forged digital signature to a cybersecurity gunfight. Visual perfection holds absolutely zero weight in digital forensics. Every electronic signature, every encrypted notary stamp, generates a microscopic trail of embedded data. I engaged my extraction software, targeting the metadata, anchoring the fraudulent signature file on the promissory note. Lines of code scrolled across the monitor as the program stripped away the superficial layers of the document. I hunted for the transmission node, the exact origin point where the digital pen struck the digital paper. The software isolated a specific internet protocol address. I launched a geolocation tracking tool, feeding the address into the search parameters. I cross-referenced the digits against regional internet service provider logs and municipal utility registries. The system processed the data, narrowing the geographical radius down to a single city block, then a single street, and finally, a specific residential address. The coordinates populated the center of my screen. The IP address did not originate from the corporate headquarters of Whitmore Logistics. It did not originate from a public coffee shop or a randomized virtual private network. The transmission node traced directly back to the residential broadband router installed in Preston's primary estate. He executed the forgery sitting in his own living room. I pulled my personal calendar from July 2026. I cross-referenced the exact timestamp of the digital signature against my own location data. At the precise moment, the forged contract executed. I sat in a secure boardroom in London, finalizing the acquisition of an international shipping hub. My passport stamps, encrypted flight manifests, and physical security logs provided an impenetrable, undeniable alibi. I existed an ocean away from the device that signed my name. I sat back, exhaling a slow, measured breath. The trap was fully illuminated. Preston engineered a lethal snare designed to end my life, but he tied the tripwire directly around his own neck. He handed me the exact weapon I required to orchestrate his federal execution. Monday, October 19th, 2026. I commanded the smart glass panels lining the perimeter of my penthouse to opaque, blocking out the morning sun rising over the city grid. I plunged the sprawling living space into a cool, artificial twilight. The time for passive forensic observation had officially expired. I transitioned from investigator to executioner, transforming my residence into a sterile, tactical war room. I networked 3 auxiliary processing units to my primary command terminal, maximizing my computing bandwidth. The cooling fans hummed in a low, continuous drone, providing the only soundtrack to the ensuing demolition. I did not sleep. I consumed scalding black coffee and pulled every extracted data file, every compromised ledger, and every digital footprint from Whitmore Logistics onto my 6 illuminated monitors. Raw financial data holds no lethal power if a prosecutor cannot easily digest the narrative. I spent the next 7 hours structuring the chaotic hemorrhage of my father's capital into a weaponized, heavily encrypted digital dossier. I applied a strict, color-coded indexing system, engineering the file to read less like an audit and more like a military targeting package. I highlighted the $9 million of corporate embezzlement in a stark, unforgiving crimson. I grouped the fabricated supply chain invoices, hyperlinking them directly to the Delaware proxy registrations. I mapped the exact chronological flow of stolen capital, linking the outgoing wire transfers from the logistics firm to the incoming deposits at the offshore clearinghouses. I marked the Cayman Islands routing numbers in absolute black. I attached Preston's luxury automotive lease agreements, the bespoke jewelry receipts, and the private aviation manifests directly to the offshore holding accounts, cementing his status as the sole beneficiary of the stolen funds. Next, I isolated the $15 million commercial loan in blinding white. I anchored the fraudulent promissory note to the center of the dossier. I attached the metadata extraction logs, highlighting the specific Internet protocol addresses that pinpointed Preston's residential broadband router. I embedded the digital timestamps marking the exact second the forged signature executed. To seal the perimeter of the trap, I uploaded my own encrypted passport stamps, international flight manifests, and physical security logs from July 2026. I erected an impenetrable, heavily documented alibi proving I existed in a secured London boardroom the moment the digital pen struck the digital paper in Preston's living room. The dossier was absolute. It left zero room for a defense attorney to introduce reasonable doubt. It established motive, means, and opportunity with suffocating precision. I compiled the files into a single, encrypted master archive. I did not dial the municipal police department. Local authorities lacked the resources, the jurisdiction, and the intellectual capacity to prosecute complex international wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. Engaging a local detective risked bureaucratic delays, evidence leaks, or a bungled chain of custody. This specific grade of treason required apex predators. I initiated a highly secure, end-to-end encrypted video link to my corporate legal counsel, my lead litigator, a woman possessing a reputation for eviscerating white-collar criminals in federal courtrooms, materialized on my secondary screen. She sat in her corner office, projecting sharp, unyielding authority. I bypassed pleasantries entirely. I dragged the encrypted dossier icon across my desktop and dropped it into our secure transfer portal. "Review the incoming package," I instructed, my voice flat, clinical, and echoing with finality. My brother forged my identity to secure $15 million in toxic commercial debt. He executed the forgery to mask a 4-year embezzlement campaign, during which he laundered an additional $9 million from my father's firm. I require immediate, catastrophic federal intervention. I watched her eyes track back and forth across her monitor as she unzipped the file. Her jaw tightened as her mind processed the IP logs, the forged notary stamps, and the Cayman routing nodes. She recognized the gravity of the documentation. She understood that I did not provide her with a defense strategy. I handed her an offensive annihilation order. "The evidence is ironclad. Jade," she stated, her fingers flying across her keyboard to secure the files on her end. "This constitutes aggravated identity theft, severe bank fraud, and international money laundering. The mandatory minimums for these federal violations will bury him." Route the unredacted dossier directly to your contacts at the white-collar crime division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, I commanded, staring at the flashing data nodes on my screen. Trigger an immediate review. I want the asset forfeiture protocols initiated the second they verify the offshore routing numbers. I pulled up the digital calendar on my terminal. I highlighted the meeting I had established with Preston and Warren 24 hours prior. Coordinate the timing of the tactical raid with surgical precision. I continued, typing the physical address of the Whitmore Logistics corporate headquarters into the chat interface. I scheduled a physical meeting with the perpetrators in their primary boardroom tomorrow morning at exactly 10 o'clock. They believe I am delivering a $20 million bailout to save their company. My litigator stopped typing, her eyes locking onto the camera. She grasped the psychological warfare I was deploying. I want the federal arrest warrant signed by a magistrate tonight, I dictated, outlining the final parameters of the trap. I want the FBI tactical teams positioned at the perimeter of the logistics firm by 9:45 tomorrow morning. Hold them in the staging area. I will enter the boardroom and initiate the engagement at 10. The tactical units will breach the lobby and execute the arrest warrants at exactly 10:15. Synchronizing the breach for 10:15, she confirmed, a lethal, approving glint flashing in her eyes. I will liaise with the federal prosecutor's office to ensure the asset freeze hits their banking portals simultaneously with the physical raid. They will possess zero capital to post bail. Execute it, I said. I terminated the connection. The screen blinked black, plunging the war room back into the low hum of cooling fans and processing servers. I stood up from the ergonomic leather chair. I walked to the edge of the room and tapped the control panel, instructing the smart glass to turn transparent. The sprawling concrete grid of the city materialized before me, bathed in the harsh, glaring light of the midday sun. My flagship commercial skyscrapers pierced the horizon, monuments to the silent, exponential power I cultivated while my family mocked my existence. I was not merely defending my credit profile against a desperate forgery. I was orchestrating a systemic, federal takedown designed to erase my father and brother's entire existence from the commercial ecosystem. They spent 16 years treating me like a disposable prop. They paraded their leased sports cars and their $2 million villas, fueled by toxic debt and stolen capital, while actively attempting to send me to a federal penitentiary to cover their tracks. They assumed my silence equated to weakness. They assumed I lacked the capacity to strike back. I placed my palm against the cool, reinforced glass of the penthouse window. I did not feel a single trace of guilt, hesitation, or mercy. The coiled spring of my restraint had vanished, replaced by an unstoppable, crushing gravity. I would spend the next 24 hours preparing my armor tomorrow morning. I would walk into their boardroom, look them dead in the eye, and watch the federal government burn their fabricated dynasty to ash. Tuesday, October 20th, 2026, exactly 10 o'clock in the morning. The heavy reinforced tires of my armored SUV rolled to a halt in front of the Whitmore Logistics corporate headquarters. I stepped out of the vehicle, the crisp autumn wind catching the lapels of my tailored blazer. I stared up at the concrete facade of the building. For 16 years, this structure represented a fortress of exclusion, a monument to my father's fabricated legacy and my brother's unearned inheritance. Today, it served as their tomb. I bypassed the revolving glass doors, pushing through the heavy side entrance. The lobby attempted to project stability, but the foundation was actively crumbling. The receptionist, a woman who usually greeted me with dismissive apathy, averted her eyes, staring intensely at her computer monitor. A palpable, suffocating tension permeated the stale corporate air. The employees sensed the plunging revenues. They felt the invisible tremors of a dying company. I did not stop at the security desk. I marched directly toward the executive elevator banks, my heels striking the polished granite floor in a sharp, rhythmic cadence. The brushed steel doors parted. I selected the top floor. I rode the elevator in absolute silence, syncing my internal clock to the exact parameters of the federal trap, 10:15. The tactical breach sat exactly 15 minutes away. The elevator chimed, depositing me into the executive corridor. I bypassed the administrative cubicles and walked straight toward the heavy mahogany double doors of the primary boardroom. I did not knock. I gripped the brass handles and thrust the doors open. Warren and Preston sat at the center of the sprawling mahogany table. They performed a pathetic, desperate pantomime of authority. They wore fresh, bespoke suits, their hair meticulously styled, utilizing expensive tailoring as armor to mask the bleeding wounds of their insolvency. A silver pitcher of ice water sat between them, accumulating condensation. Warren steepled his fingers, puffing his chest out, attempting to project the aura of an unbothered titan. Preston rolled his shoulders backward, plastering a smug, artificial smirk across his face. I closed the heavy mahogany doors behind me, sealing the room. I did not offer a greeting. I walked to the opposite end of the table and stood behind the leather executive chair, resting my hands flat against the high backrest. I locked my eyes onto Preston, waiting for the prey to initiate the engagement. Preston broke first. He reached down to the polished wood surface and tapped a thick, cream-colored document resting in front of him. "Punctual?" Preston clipped, his voice tight, lacking its usual arrogant resonance. He shoved the document across the expanse of the table. It slid across the mahogany, stopping exactly 6 inches from my fingertips. "The transfer authorization," Preston instructed, gesturing sharply toward the paper. $20 million, sign on the final page. Our routing numbers for the central operating account are printed in the appendix. We require the wire initiated before noon to clear the international supply chain. Holds. I looked down at the contract. They requested $20 million of liquid capital without providing a single financial ledger, a single asset appraisal, or a single corporate guarantee. The sheer, unadulterated arrogance required to demand an 8-figure bailout based entirely on unearned entitlement defied logic. Warren leaned forward, placing his forearms on the table, attempting to deploy a paternal tone he had never once utilized in my presence. "We are a family, Jade," Warren stated, his eyes darting to the contract, betraying his manufactured calm. "You caused a significant unnecessary disruption this weekend with that Forbes article. The optics damaged our short-term leverage. But this capital injection proves you understand loyalty. You execute the transfer. We stabilize the logistics network. And we move past this unfortunate incident." They intended to gaslight me one final time. They expected me to fund my own destruction, assuming my newfound wealth obligated me to salvage the very men who spent my entire life attempting to erase me. I reached into the interior pocket of my blazer. My fingers closed around the cool, engraved metal of my silver fountain pen. I extracted it, bringing it down to the table. I rested the heavy silver barrel gently atop the cream-colored transfer contract. The metal clicked softly against the wood. I did not uncap the pen. I did not reach for the signature line. I lifted my gaze, anchoring my stare directly into Preston's dilated pupils. I reached down to the floor, grasping the handle of the heavy, distressed leather briefcase I carried into the building. I hoisted it onto the table. I popped the brass locks. I extracted the dense, heavily encrypted, color-coded audit portfolio I had assembled in my penthouse war room. I picked up Preston's $20 million demand and dropped it onto the floor. It fluttered down, landing on the carpet near my feet. I placed my audit portfolio onto the mahogany table. I placed my hands flat against the spine and shoved it forward. The heavy binder slid across the polished wood with a loud, abrasive scraping sound, halting directly in front of Preston's chest. "I do not sign blind capital injections," I stated, my voice dropping into a hollow, glacial register. "Open the portfolio, Preston." Preston scoffed, a nervous, erratic sound escaping his throat. He glanced at Warren, seeking validation. Warren frowned, his steepled fingers tightening, failing to comprehend the deviation from his script. "What is this, Jade?" Preston sneered, attempting to maintain his facade. "I do not have time to review your real estate prospectus. Sign the transfer document." "Open the portfolio," I repeated, the absolute, unyielding authority in my tone, stripping the oxygen from the room. Preston's smirk faltered. He reached out, his fingers brushing the heavy cardstock cover. He flipped the portfolio open. I watched the exact sequence of his psychological demolition. His eyes scanned the first page. I had highlighted the $9 million of corporate embezzlement in stark, unforgiving crimson ink. He read the names of the Delaware shell companies, Apex Freight Solutions, Meridian Logistics Partners, Vanguard Transport Supply. He saw the outgoing wire transfers, the exact dates, and the precise monetary values he had siphoned from his father's central operating account. Preston's breathing hitched. A sharp, audible gasp hissed through his teeth. The blood abandoned his cheeks, leaving his skin the color of wet ash. He frantically flipped the page, his hands beginning to tremble. He encountered the black ink mapping the Cayman Islands routing numbers. He saw the itemized receipts, the charcoal gray European sports car, the diamonds, the Aspen aviation charters, the irrefutable proof that he bled his father's legacy dry to fund his own pathetic, fabricated illusions stared back at him. Warren noticed the physical deterioration of his golden child. He leaned to the side, attempting to read the documents from his angle. "Preston, what is it? What did she give you?" Preston did not answer. He could not speak. His vocal cords seized, paralyzed by the sheer terror flooding his nervous system. His shaking fingers grabbed the corner of the heavy paper. Turning to the third section of the portfolio, he reached the blinding white section. He encountered the scanned replica of the $15 million promissory note. He saw my printed name. He saw my social security number. He saw the masterfully forged digital signature and the encrypted notary stamp. The arrogant, entitled executive completely evaporated. A visceral, agonizing panic shattered his features. He realized I knew about the toxic bridge loan. He realized I knew about the impending default designed to send me to a federal penitentiary. Preston's eyes darted frantically down the page, slamming into the kill shot. He read the metadata extraction logs. He processed the isolated internet protocol addresses. He saw the geolocation map pinpointing the exact transmission node to the broadband router sitting in his own residential living room. He saw the timestamp of the forgery juxtaposed against the encrypted flight manifests and security logs proving I sat in a secured London boardroom the exact second the digital pen struck the digital paper. The portfolio did not merely expose a lie, it delivered a federal execution order. Preston's physical collapse was absolute. His elbows gave out, his forearms crashing onto the mahogany table, his hands clawed at the documents, crumpling the edges of the heavyweight paper. His chest heaved in rapid, shallow spasms, desperately attempting to pull oxygen into lungs that refused to expand. A guttural, choking sound ripped from his throat, the sound of a predator realizing he had just stepped onto a landmine. "Preston," Warren shouted, his confusion morphing into alarm. The patriarch scrambled out of his leather chair, rushing to his son's side. He grabbed Preston's shoulder, shaking him. "What is on those pages? Speak to me." Preston slowly lifted his head. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and completely devoid of sanity. He looked at Warren, then dragged his horrified gaze across the length of the mahogany table, locking onto my face. He finally comprehended the magnitude of his fatal error. He brought a forged signature to a forensic gunfight against an apex intellect. He recognized that the $20 million demand was irrelevant. He realized that the sister he mocked as a nobody possessed the exact digital footprint required to bury him in a concrete cell for the next 20 years. I stood motionless, my hands resting lightly on the back of the leather chair. I watched the absolute, paralyzing horror consume his soul. I checked the heavy silver watch secured around my left wrist. 10:14. The trap was fully illuminated. The federal hammer hung suspended, waiting for gravity to take over. 10:15. The digital clock mounted on the mahogany-paneled wall rolled the integer forward. Gravity took over. Warren shoved Preston aside. The patriarch grabbed the heavy cardstock cover of the audit portfolio, his fingers digging into the rigid spine. He ripped the pages open, desperate to comprehend the paralysis gripping his son. He bypassed the initial embezzlement flowcharts, his frantic gaze slamming directly into the blinding white section detailing the $15 million commercial loan. He read my printed name. He saw the forged digital signature. He stared at the notary stamps anchoring the massive, toxic debt to my pristine credit profile. Then, his eyes tracked the routing maps I had meticulously annotated. He followed the black ink detailing the trajectory of the stolen capital. The funds did not merely vanish into generic offshore accounts. I had cross-referenced the Cayman Islands shell companies against federal watch lists. The routing nodes Preston utilized operated as known, blacklisted conduits for international cartel syndicates. Preston had unknowingly shoved $15 million of fraudulently acquired capital directly through radioactive, heavily monitored cartel arteries to mask his theft. Before Warren could force his vocal cords to produce a single sound, a concussive impact detonated several floors below us. The structural vibration traveled up the steel girders of the building, rattling the soles of my shoes. A deafening, explosive crash echoed up the elevator shafts, the unmistakable sound of heavy, shatter-resistant architectural glass violently giving way. A localized security alarm shrieked to life. The high-decibel siren pierced the executive corridor, flooding the boardroom with a piercing, rhythmic wail. I turned away from the mahogany table. I walked toward the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the primary corporate courtyard, my heels striking the carpet in a slow, measured cadence. I pressed my palm against the cool glass and looked down. 36 federal agents swarmed the plaza. They moved with ruthless, synchronized tactical precision. They wore dark navy windbreakers emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Black armored transport vehicles jumped the concrete curbs, violently sealing the entrance to the logistics loading docks. Armed tactical units secured the perimeter, blocking every exit, every side door, and every subterranean parking ramp. The flashing red and blue strobe lights from the federal vehicles painted the plaza in a chaotic, rotating glare, casting long, erratic shadows across the pavement. The siege was absolute, the building locked down completely. Behind me, the heavy audit portfolio slipped from Warren's hands. The binder struck the polished mahogany with a dull, hollow thud. Loose pages cascaded across the wood, fluttering down to rest on the carpet. Warren staggered backward. His polished leather shoes tangled against each other. He collided with the wall, his spine hitting the drywall with a heavy slump. The blaring sirens provided the soundtrack to his total cognitive collapse. The patriarch connected the dots. He looked at the scattered documents, then listened to the chaotic shouts echoing up from the lobby. Preston did not just bankrupt Whitmore Logistics. Preston committed aggravated federal bank fraud using my identity. Furthermore, Preston injected radioactive cartel capital into the corporate veins of the company Warren spent 40 years building. The logistics firm no longer represented a failing business. It constituted an active federal crime scene. As the chief executive officer, Warren realized he sat directly in the crosshairs of a massive racketeering investigation. The federal government would freeze his personal assets. The cartels would hunt his associates. Warren raised a trembling hand, pointing a shaking finger at his golden child. He recoiled from Preston as if the younger man radiated a lethal contagion. Warren's chest heaved, his mouth opening in a silent scream of absolute, unmitigated horror. His legacy burned to ash right in front of his eyes, immolated by the sheer arrogance of the son he chose to elevate over the daughter who could have saved him. The heavy boots of the tactical entry teams thundered up the primary stairwells. The rapid, synchronized stomping vibrated through the floorboards of the boardroom. The panicked shrieks of the administrative assistants down the hall mixed with the roar of walkie-talkie static. "Secure the executive wing hands where I can see them. Nobody moves!" A federal voice roared in the corridor outside. Preston's knees buckled. The bespoke suit, the leased sports car, the $2 million villa, the entire fabricated armor he wore to project superiority, completely disintegrated. He crashed onto the boardroom carpet, landing heavily on his hands and knees. The golden child broke. He began to hyperventilate, pulling in jagged, desperate gasps of air that failed to fill his lungs. Tears streamed down his face, ruining his meticulously styled appearance. A pathetic, high-pitched whimpering sound escaped his throat. He crawled across the carpet. He dragged his knees over the scattered pages of the audit portfolio. ignoring the evidence of his own treason crushing beneath his weight. He reached the toe of my leather shoe. His shaking hands shot forward, clawing at the hem of my tailored trousers. "Jade," Preston sobbed, his voice cracking into a hysterical, breathless plea. "Jade, please, you have to stop them. You have to tell them." I looked down at the top of his head. I did not step away. I allowed him to cling to my hem, observing the absolute degradation of a man who spent 16 years treating me like a disposable prop. "I will give you the villa," Preston babbled, his words blurring together in a frantic, unhinged stream of consciousness. "I will sign the title over to you today. I will surrender my shares in the firm. I will work in the back office. Just tell them I authorized the transaction with your permission. Tell the agents we had a verbal agreement." He looked up at me, his eyes wide, bloodshot, and completely devoid of sanity. Saliva pooled at the corner of his mouth. "Tell them you approved the $15 million loan for the company. Tell them it was just a family misunderstanding. Please, they are going to lock me away. I cannot survive in a federal prison. Jade, I cannot do it." He expected me to absorb the blow. He demanded I perjure myself to federal investigators, risking my own freedom, my $4.5 billion empire, and my entire existence, merely to shield him from the consequences of his own sociopathy. The depth of his narcissistic delusion defied human comprehension. He truly believed his survival superseded my reality. The brass handles of the boardroom doors rattled violently. The tactical breach of our room sat mere seconds away. I did not offer him a lifeline. I did not express anger, pity, or vindication. I engaged a state of absolute, glacial detachment. The apex predator does not negotiate with the prey thrashing in the snare. I reached down and smoothly unclasped his trembling fingers from the premium fabric of my trousers. I pried his hands away with surgical revulsion, dropping his wrists back onto the floor. I raised my arms, deliberately adjusting the starched cuffs of my blazer, ensuring the fabric rested perfectly flush against my wrists. I lifted my foot, stepping directly over his hyperventilating, crumpled body. I looked down at him one final time, my voice echoing with terrifying, hollow finality over the blaring sirens. "I dismantle financial lies for a living, Preston," I stated, staring into his terrified, weeping eyes. "And you brought a forgery to a forensic gunfight." The heavy mahogany doors exploded inward. The tactical extraction of my family required exactly 6 hours to process. By 4 o'clock on Tuesday afternoon, the federal machinery had completely digested Whitmore logistics. The Federal Bureau of Investigation transported the perpetrators to the downtown field office, initiating the formal booking procedures for aggravated identity theft, severe bank fraud, and international money laundering. My lead litigator navigated our black armored SUV through the secured subterranean parking garage of the federal building. We cleared the internal security checkpoints, surrendering our devices and presenting our credentials. We traversed a labyrinth of cinder-block corridors. The air inside the federal facility smelled of ozone, floor wax, and stale coffee, carrying the heavy, institutional weight of absolute consequence. A senior federal agent waited for us outside Interrogation Room 4. He nodded respectfully toward my attorney, recognizing the architect of the irrefutable digital dossier that handed his division a massive, career-defining prosecution on a silver platter. He unlocked the heavy steel door, pulling the brass handle downward with a sharp, mechanical clack. I crossed the threshold, stepping into the bleak, fluorescent-lit concrete box. My attorney flanked my right side, projecting an impenetrable aura of legal supremacy. The interrogation room offered zero comfort. A scarred metal table sat bolted to the center of the linoleum floor. A two-way mirror dominated the right wall. The harsh, overhead fluorescent tubes hummed in a low, continuous drone, casting a sickly, pale light over the occupant. Preston sat shackled to the metal table. The physical deterioration of the golden child was absolute. He no longer resembled the 38-year-old arrogant executive who toasted his $2 million villa in a crystal-lit banquet hall 4 days prior. He looked like a cornered, feral animal, The federal agents had stripped him of his silk tie and his leather belt. His ruined bespoke suit hung off his frame, the fabric violently wrinkled, stained with perspiration and spilled coffee. Thick steel handcuffs bit brutally into his wrists. A heavy iron chain connected the cuffs directly to a steel ring welded to the center of the table, restricting his movement to a pathetic 12-inch radius. 2 federal agents sat across from him, reviewing printouts from the color-coded audit portfolio I had engineered in my penthouse. Preston did not immediately register my entrance. He was actively sobbing, his chest heaving in rapid, jagged spasms. Tears carved tracks through the grime on his face, and mucus gathered at his upper lip. He leaned forward as far as the iron chain permitted, desperately pleading with the agents. He was in the middle of executing a total, unmitigated betrayal of his own father. "You have to look at the macro-level operational budgets," Preston shrieked, his voice cracking into a hysterical, high-pitched whine. He rattled his handcuffs against the metal table, attempting to emphasize his frantic defense. "Warren authorized everything. I am just a vice president. I executed his directives. He demanded the capital liquidity to maintain his status at the country club. He forced me to find the cash." The senior agent flipped a page in the dossier, his expression remaining entirely stoic. "The offshore Cayman routing numbers link directly to your personal automotive leases and aviation charters. Preston, the $9 million funded your lifestyle." He knew about the offshore funnels. Preston sobbed, spit flying from his lips, landing on the scratched metal surface. "Warren masterminded the corporate structures. He told me to bleed the vendor accounts to prop up the logistics fleet. He pressured me to fix the balance sheets. I can testify against him. I will testify against him. You give me a plea agreement, and I will give you Warren Whitmore on a silver platter. I will hand you the chief executive officer." I stood silently near the heavy steel door, observing the grotesque display. The scene proved a fundamental, immutable truth: absolute zero loyalty exists among narcissists. The moment the federal hammer dropped, the unbreakable bond between the patriarch and his golden child shattered into dust. Preston eagerly offered his father's head to the executioner, desperate to shave a single month off his impending incarceration. He possessed no honor, no spine, and no moral center. He existed solely as a parasite, perfectly willing to consume his host to survive. My lead litigator cleared her throat, a sharp, authoritative sound that instantly commanded the room. Preston's frantic rambling ceased. He snapped his head toward the entrance, his bloodshot. Swollen eyes locked onto my face, the sheer terror flooding his nervous system spiked, paralyzing his vocal cords. The 2 federal agents stood up from the metal table, acknowledging my arrival. My attorney stepped forward, establishing the parameters of the engagement. My client, the primary victim of the $15 million commercial identity theft, requested a brief moment to observe the perpetrator, my litigator stated, her tone slicing through the stale air. "She operates as a cooperating witness for the federal prosecution. We require exactly 2 minutes. The senior agent nodded. He gathered his files, gesturing for his partner to follow. They bypassed Preston without a second glance, stepping out of the interrogation room and allowing the heavy steel door to click shut behind them. I remained standing. The silence in the concrete box stretched, stretching the psychological tension until the atmosphere felt thick enough to shatter. Preston stared at me. He looked at my tailored blazer, my perfectly manicured hands, and my unyielding posture. He searched my face for a shred of the sister he had marginalized and mocked for 16 years. He searched for empathy. He searched for a savior. He found a glacier. "Jade," Preston whimpered, his voice a pathetic, raspy whisper. He pulled against the iron chain, the steel cuffs biting deeper into his wrists, scraping against the bone. "Jade, please, you heard them. They are threatening me with a 20-year federal sentence. 2 decades. I will die in there." He swallowed hard, fresh tears spilling over his eyelashes. He attempted to deploy the familial manipulation tactics that had governed our childhood, entirely oblivious to the fact that his ammunition was obsolete. "We are family," Preston begged, his chin trembling violently. "I know I made mistakes. I know I handled the logistics firm poorly, but I am your brother. You cannot let them bury me in a concrete cell. You have the resources. You own the private equity conglomerate. You can hire the best defense attorneys in the country. You can pay off the $15 million. You can fix this. He actually believed I would finance his legal defense. He believed I would deploy my $4.5 billion empire to rescue the man who forged my signature to fund his luxury vacations. His arrogance morphed into a blinding, terminal delusion. I did not raise my voice. I did not hurl insults, scream about the betrayal, or demand apologies. Emotional outbursts surrender power to the antagonist. I retained absolute, suffocating control of the narrative. I walked forward, my heels clicking sharply against the linoleum, pacing off the exact distance to the metal table. I stopped precisely 2 feet from his hunched, trembling form. I planted my hands flat against the cold, scarred metal surface. I leaned forward, invading his proximity, forcing him to absorb the raw, unmitigated gravity of my presence. I looked directly into his terrified, weeping eyes. I maintained eye contact until I watched the final flicker of hope extinguish in his pupils. I dropped my vocal register into a hollow, chilling whisper, echoing his own arrogant words from the crystal-lit banquet hall right back into his face. I guess you will need a small desk in the back of the prison. The words struck him with kinetic force. Preston recoiled violently. He threw his torso backward, crashing against the metal backrest of his interrogation chair. The iron chain snapped taut. Jerking his wrists downward, he gasped, a sharp, agonizing intake of breath, as if I had physically driven a blade into his sternum. His mouth hung open. But he could not generate a single sound. The reality of his 20-year federal sentence finally crushed his spine. He realized that the sister he designated a nobody possessed the power to permanently erase him from the world, and she possessed zero intention of showing mercy. I held his horrified gaze for one final, agonizing second. I pushed myself off the metal table. I stood up perfectly straight. I deliberately adjusted the cuffs of my tailored blazer, ensuring the premium fabric rested flawlessly against my wrists. I turned my back on his ruined, hyperventilating existence. I walked toward the heavy steel door. My litigator pushed the handle down, holding the exit open for me. I stepped across the threshold, leaving the bleak, fluorescent-lit concrete box behind. I walked down the cinder-block corridor, the heavy steel door slamming shut, locking Preston inside a cage entirely constructed by his own catastrophic arrogance. November 2026. The federal justice system operates without malice, relying entirely on mechanical, unyielding efficiency. Over the subsequent 6 weeks, I monitored the systematic, brutal dismantling of my bloodline from the command terminal in my penthouse. The collapse of Whitmore Logistics occurred first. The Federal Bureau of Investigation did not merely seize the corporate headquarters, they gutted it. I pulled the municipal news feeds and watched federal agents carry cardboard boxes overflowing with hard drives, physical ledgers, and encrypted servers out of the glass lobby. The Department of Justice initiated immediate asset forfeiture protocols to satisfy the defrauded creditors and the toxic $15 million commercial loan. Liquidators descended upon the transport fleet like scavengers, the heavy diesel trucks, the international shipping containers, and the branded logistics uniforms hit the municipal auction block. The auctioneer's gavel slammed down repeatedly, selling off Warren's 40-year legacy for pennies on the dollar. The corporate signage, bearing the Whitmore name in massive steel letters, was unbolted from the concrete facade and dropped into a scrapyard dumpster. I finalized the corporate erasure by utilizing a blind proxy trust to purchase his primary distribution hub at a steep discount. I absorbed his remaining infrastructure into my $4.5 billion conglomerate without leaving a single fingerprint. The frozen banking nodes triggered Vanessa's immediate, ruthless departure the moment federal prosecutors locked the Cayman Islands routing accounts, severing her access to bespoke jewelry and Aspen aviation charters. She executed her exit strategy. She demonstrated zero loyalty to a caged golden child. My corporate legal team forwarded me the public civil dockets. Vanessa retained a vicious divorce attorney, filing the dissolution paperwork citing irreconcilable differences and criminal fraud. She packed her remaining designer apparel into her least luxury sedan and vanished. She did not visit the federal detention center. She dispatched a process server to hand Preston his divorce papers through a plexiglass partition. She abandoned him completely, severing her legal ties to the sinking ship, and left him to face a 20-year federal sentence without a single ally. The $2 million Scottsdale villa Preston accepted with such arrogant pride never saw him inhabit its walls. He possessed the brass key for exactly 4 days before the federal government stripped it from his hands. I accessed the regional property registries and tracked the deed transfer. Federal marshals arrived at the Arizona estate, drilled out the locks, and seized the property. By late November, the pristine 4-bedroom home featuring the mountain views he boasted about hit the federal auction block. The government liquidated the asset to cover his restitution, erasing Preston's unearned crown before he even unpacked his luggage. Warren faced a federal grand jury. The prosecutors indicted the patriarch on multiple counts of aiding and abetting corporate fraud, piercing the corporate veil he hid behind. The impending litigation and exorbitant defense retainers vaporized his remaining liquid capital. However, the fatal blow to his psyche did not arrive via a federal subpoena. It arrived at the gates of his sanctuary. Because my private equity firm held the master commercial lease for the elite country club, I possessed unrestricted administrative access to their perimeter security feeds. I pulled the video logs from a crisp Tuesday morning in November. Warren drove a mid-tier rental sedan up to the guard shack, his luxury vehicles having been seized by the authorities. He attempted to enter the grounds. The mechanical barrier arm remained locked in the horizontal position. The security guard stepped out of the booth, refusing to accept Warren's credentials. Instead, the guard handed him a crisp white envelope. The board of directors formally revoked his membership, invoking the moral turpitude clause embedded in their bylaws. They demanded he surrender his locker keys and permanently banned him from the premises. I watched the high-definition security footage as Warren tore the envelope open. His shoulders slumped. He argued with the guard, pointing frantically at the clubhouse. But the guard simply stepped back and crossed his arms. Warren was forced to shift his rental car into reverse, backing down the winding driveway in absolute disgrace, while his former peers drove past him without offering a single glance. He lost his audience, his status, and his fabricated legacy in a single, devastating keystroke. Sylvia absorbed the devastating collateral damage of her decades of enabling, with the logistics estate seized and the personal bank accounts drained by federal asset freezes. She faced immediate eviction from the sprawling suburban mansion she prized above her own daughter. She packed her seized belongings into cardboard boxes and relocated to the industrial outskirts of the city. I accessed the municipal utility registries to verify her new coordinates. She secured a cramped, low-income apartment in a deteriorating complex. The environment stood in brutal contrast to the silk-lined banquet halls she navigated weeks prior. I visualized her reality-stained carpeting, replacing Brazilian hardwood, a rattling heating unit replacing central climate control, a cracked asphalt parking lot replacing manicured topiary gardens. She attempted to maintain her illusions, desperately seeking refuge among the high society matriarchs she hosted at charity luncheons. My surveillance algorithms tracked her digital interactions. She dialed their numbers repeatedly. Her calls routed directly to voicemail. The elite women blocked her contact information. When Sylvia ventured to the discount grocery store, former acquaintances actively crossed the street to avoid intersecting her path. The society friends she prioritized over her own flesh and blood executed a flawless, silent excommunication. They amputated her from their social registry, treating the Whitmore name like a terminal contagion. Her identity, entirely dependent on her proximity to wealth and status, evaporated into the smog of the industrial district. The erasure from the elite ecosystem proved absolute and irreversible. They spent 16 years treating me like a ghost, rendering me invisible to inflate their fragile egos. Now, the hierarchy had permanently inverted. They existed as phantoms, wandering through a world that aggressively forgot them. I observed their ruin from the stratosphere, insulated by a titanium fortress of my own making, completely unaffected by the ashes of their fabricated dynasty. December 2026. The winter solstice arrived, dragging a bruised, metallic twilight across the geometric grid of the city. I stepped out onto the wraparound terrace of my penthouse, pushing the heavy, reinforced glass door along its tracks. The mechanism sealed shut behind me with a definitive, pneumatic click, isolating me from the low, continuous hum of the processing servers inside my war room. The freezing wind whipped the premium silk fabric of my trousers, biting at my skin. But I welcomed the icy shock. It felt like absolute, unmitigated purification. I stepped to the edge of the terrace and rested my hands flat against the freezing metal railing, 50 stories below. The urban arteries pulsed with the red and white streaks of rush-hour traffic. I elevated my gaze, tracking the fading sunlight as it struck the mirrored facades of the commercial high-rises anchoring the financial district. The glass caught the dying light, burning like pillars of copper against the darkening horizon. I traced the skyline, identifying the distinct architectural silhouettes piercing the clouds. I owned the ground beneath their foundations. I held the master commercial leases for the steel towers. I controlled the distribution hubs fueling the industrial sectors churning in the distance. The city stretched out before me, an expansive, sprawling monopoly, and I commanded it entirely. I lifted a crystal goblet to my lips. The vintage Cabernet washed over my palate, delivering complex notes of oak and dark fruit. The warmth of the wine contrasted sharply with the bitter winter wind. I swallowed, savoring the profound, undisturbed peace of a fully cleansed existence. The knot of psychological tension that had occupied the base of my spine for 16 years had completely evaporated. Warren and Preston spent a decade and a half mistaking my silence for submission. They operated under the fatal delusion that volume equated to power. They broadcasted their insecurities through leased European sports cars, desperate country club toasts, and fabricated titles. They required a captive audience to validate their existence. They needed a designated failure to absorb their toxicity and elevate their fragile egos. I required no audience. I required capital, data, and absolute anonymity. I reflected on the ultimate supremacy of the silent execution. While they performed their pathetic, aristocratic pantomime in rented banquet halls, I laid the titanium foundation of my empire. I did not waste oxygen attempting to convince arrogant men of my worth. I did not engage in theatrical screaming matches or beg for a seat at a table built on rotting wood. I let them construct their own gallows. I handed them the rope, allowed them to secure the knot, and simply waited for the precise, mathematically perfect moment to pull the lever. I turned away from the railing and stepped back into the climate-controlled sanctuary of my penthouse. The biometric locks engaged instantly, securing the perimeter. I navigated across the Brazilian hardwood floors, bypassing the central command terminal. I did not need to monitor the municipal dockets or the bankruptcy filings tonight. The logistics firm had been entirely liquidated. Preston sat confined within a federal penitentiary, serving his 20-year sentence. Warren wandered the industrial outskirts of the city, a pariah stripped of his wealth and his manufactured legacy. Sylvia existed in cramped, low-income isolation, permanently exiled from the society that defined her. Their erasure from the ecosystem was complete. The bloodline was severed. I walked toward the sprawling leather sectional dominating the center of the room. I set my crystal goblet onto the polished slate coffee table. I picked up a heavily encrypted tablet resting next to the wine bottle. A secure communication channel flashed on the screen. My lead corporate litigator, the woman who orchestrated the federal raid with surgical precision, transmitted the final asset forfeiture summaries. Beneath her message, my chief financial officer forwarded the quarterly projections for our newly acquired logistics infrastructure. Gregory Pierce, the Forbes editor who detonated the initial narrative, sent a brief, professional inquiry regarding an upcoming feature on sovereign private equity. I scanned the messages, a cold, sharp satisfaction taking root in my chest. I possess no family, and I experienced zero grief over that fact. I had systematically replaced a toxic, parasitic bloodline with a chosen phalanx of apex professionals. I surrounded myself with a lethal, hyper-competent team of financial architects, corporate attorneys, and security specialists. They did not demand my subservience. They did not mock my ambition. They respected my intellect, my strategic ruthlessness, and my capacity to generate exponential wealth. We operated in an ecosystem governed by absolute merit, insulated entirely from the petty, fabricated statuses that destroyed my father and brother. I had built a titanium fortress, and the people standing inside the walls possessed the exact same glacial resolve that I did. I set the tablet down and picked up my wine glass. I walked back toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out into the sprawling, illuminated grid of the night. The defining lesson of this journey is that true power is never loud. Toxic people will always attempt to project their own deep-seated insecurities onto you, minimizing your worth to inflate their fragile, crumbling egos. They mistake silent endurance for weakness. They assume your refusal to engage in their chaotic drama signals a lack of capacity to fight back. But your intrinsic value is not determined by the arrogant, limiting labels placed upon you by others. You do not require their validation to exist, and you certainly do not require their permission to conquer. When you build your life on a titanium foundation of absolute competence, integrity, and self-reliance, you render their manipulations entirely powerless. You strip away their leverage, walk away from tables where respect is not served, and let your undeniable success be the ultimate judge, jury, and executioner. Please hit that like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more stories of justice and empowerment. Thank you so much for watching, and stay strong.